Picture this: over 5,000 years ago, in a landscape that would make today's most ambitious city planners weep with envy, something extraordinary was happening between two mighty rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't just waterways, they were the birthplace of everything we recognize as modern civilization, and what unfolded in this fertile valley would change the course of human history forever. The story begins in the 4th millennium BCE, when the rich, muddy deposits left by annual floods created some of the most productive farmland our planet had ever seen. But here's where it gets interesting. Simply having good soil wasn't enough. The real magic happened when small farming communities realized they needed to work together to survive and thrive in this challenging environment. Enter the Sumerians, a people whose mysterious origins continue to puzzle archaeologists today. Around 3,500 BCE, these ingenious settlers didn't just build villages, they invented the very concept of the city. Think about that for a moment. Before the Sumerians, humans had never created anything resembling urban civilization. They were literally making it up as they went along, and their innovations would echo through every civilization that followed. But why did cities emerge here in this specific place and time? The answer lies in water, specifically the complex challenge of managing it. The annual floods brought life-giving nutrients, but successful farming required channeling that water precisely where and when it was needed during the dry seasons. This wasn't a one-person job or even a one-family operation. It demanded coordination between hundreds, then thousands of people. And here's where human society took a dramatic turn. Managing these massive irrigation projects required leadership, organization, and social structures that had never existed before. Archaeological discoveries at Uruk revealed just how quickly this transformation occurred. By 3200 BCE, what had been modest settlements had exploded into genuine cities housing tens of thousands of people. Imagine witnessing that growth. It would have been like watching humanity level up in real time. These weren't random collections of buildings thrown together haphazardly. Sumerian cities were masterpieces of urban planning that reflected a sophisticated understanding of how societies function. Towering above everything else were the ziggurats, massive temple complexes that served as the beating heart of city life. These weren't just religious buildings. They were the equivalent of combining today's city hall, bank, and cathedral into one awe-inspiring structure. Take the White Temple at Uruk, completed around 3200 BCE. This architectural marvel sat atop a 40-foot artificial platform, its gleaming limestone walls visible for miles across the surrounding plains. Building something like this required coordinating the labor of thousands of workers, a logistical feat that demonstrates just how sophisticated Sumerian society had become in a remarkably short time. Around these temple complexes, entire neighborhoods buzzed with activity. Skilled artisans crafted pottery, textiles, and metal goods that would travel thousands of miles along trade routes stretching from the Persian Gulf to distant mountains. Merchants negotiated deals that would make modern business executives envious, while farmers developed agricultural techniques that supported populations larger than many modern towns. The political innovations emerging from these cities would prove just as revolutionary as their architectural achievements. The institution of kingship evolved from practical military leadership during conflicts between rival cities, but Sumerian rulers quickly discovered something that would influence governance for millennia to come. Divine authority sold better than mere human leadership. Kings began claiming their power came directly from the gods themselves, establishing the concept of divine mandate that would characterize Near Eastern rulership for thousands of years. The earliest known historical ruler, Anembrages of Kish, appears in both archaeological records and later literary sources around 2700 BCE, perfectly illustrating how Sumerian political traditions seamlessly blended historical reality with mythological narrative. But perhaps the most revolutionary Sumerian innovation was something that might seem mundane today. Writing around 3200 BCE, Sumerian scribes began pressing wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets, creating the world's first writing system. What started as simple pictographs quickly evolved into something far more powerful, a tool capable of recording not just objects and quantities, but abstract ideas and complex relationships. The earliest tablets from Uruk read like ancient business ledgers, documenting economic transactions, temple inventories, and land distributions. But these seemingly boring records reveal something extraordinary. Writing emerged as the solution to managing increasingly complex economic relationships. As societies grew more sophisticated, human memory alone couldn't handle the administrative demands of urban life. The wedge-shaped marks that gave cuneiform its distinctive appearance enabled scribes to represent concepts that had never been written down before. Temple archives from the early dynastic period contain thousands of tablets documenting everything from grain distributions to livestock counts to craft production quotas. These records reveal economic systems of staggering complexity, where temple institutions managed vast agricultural estates and maintained trade relationships spanning continents. Scribes trained in specialized schools became a professional class, whose literacy granted them significant social status and political influence. In a largely illiterate society, the ability to read and write was essentially a superpower. Religious practices became increasingly codified through written texts, preserving theological concepts that would persist throughout Mesopotamian history. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though reaching its final form much later, originated in these early Sumerian oral traditions. Writing allowed cultural narratives to be preserved and transmitted across generations, establishing archetypal themes of heroism, divine justice, and human mortality that would influence Near Eastern literature for centuries. During the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE, new players entered the Mesopotamian stage. Semitic-speaking peoples began migrating from the Arabian Peninsula and Levantine regions. But their arrival wasn't the violent conquest that movies might suggest. Instead, archaeological evidence reveals a fascinating process of gradual integration, intermarriage, and cultural exchange that would create something entirely new. The Akkadian language began appearing in cuneiform texts around 2500 BCE, initially alongside Sumerian rather than replacing it. Bilingual inscriptions reveal how both languages coexisted, with many individuals functioning effectively in both linguistic communities. Personal names in administrative documents show mixed Sumerian-Akkadian heritage, indicating extensive intermarriage between these populations. This cultural fusion produced a distinctive Mesopotamian civilization that combined Sumerian institutional innovations with Semitic linguistic and cultural elements. Akkadian speakers adopted Sumerian religious practices while introducing their own deities. The god Marduk, who would later become central to Babylonian religion, appears to have Semitic origins but was seamlessly integrated into the existing Sumerian pantheon. The political landscape of early dynastic Mesopotamia, between 2900 and 2334 BCE, resembled a high-stakes game played by city-states, competing for regional dominance through warfare, diplomacy, and economic manipulation. Each city controlled surrounding agricultural territories, while maintaining distinct political identities, operating as sovereign entities whose kings claimed divine sanction from patron deities. Uruk emerged as one of the most powerful players in this game, controlling extensive irrigation networks along the Euphrates River and maintaining trade connections reaching from the Indus Valley to Anatolia. The city's massive walls protected a population that may have exceeded 50,000 inhabitants during its peak, making it larger than many modern cities. This remarkable transformation from scattered farming villages to sophisticated urban civilization occurred in less than a millennium, representing one of the most dramatic developmental leaps in human history. The innovations pioneered by these ancient Mesopotamians, writing, urban planning, political organization, and complex economics, remain the foundation of every civilization that followed. What happened next would make even today's most successful entrepreneurs jealous. These Mesopotamian cities didn't just survive, they became trading powerhouses that connected 3 continents. And the evidence of their incredible wealth? It's literally buried in the ground, waiting to tell us stories of riches that would make ancient kings weep with envy. Consider this mind-blowing discovery. When archaeologists excavated the royal cemetery at Ur, they uncovered treasures that read like an ancient globalization success story. Gold jewelry from distant Anatolia, brilliant blue lapis lazuli sourced from Afghanistan's remote mountains, and perfectly crafted carnelian beads from the Indus Valley. This wasn't just local prosperity. This was evidence of trade networks spanning thousands of miles, connecting civilizations that most people assume never knew each other existed. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. The elaborate burial practices discovered at Ur reveal something shocking about early dynastic society. Royal retainers were sacrificed alongside their rulers, demonstrating social stratification so extreme that human lives were considered disposable accessories for the afterlife. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic demonstrations of power that would make medieval kings look restrained by comparison. Meanwhile, Kish had positioned itself as the ultimate strategic player in this ancient Game of Thrones. Located in northern Babylonia, the city controlled the vital trade arteries connecting Mesopotamia's northern and southern regions. But Kish's rulers understood something crucial about power. Sometimes the title matters more than the territory. They claimed the designation King of Kish, which became synonymous with dominance over multiple city-states. This title carried such prestige that later Akkadian rulers would adopt it, proving that some brands are simply timeless. The military innovations emerging during this period would revolutionize warfare for centuries to come. Forget everything you think you know about ancient combat. These civilizations were developing technologies and tactics that wouldn't look out of place in a modern military academy. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated bronze weapons, horse-drawn chariots, and organized infantry formations that required unprecedented levels of coordination and resources. The Standard of Ur, dating to approximately 2600 BCE, provides a stunning visual record of Sumerian military might. It depicts soldiers wearing leather helmets and wielding copper-tipped spears, advancing in disciplined formations that demonstrate tactical sophistication, rivaling later Roman legions. These military innovations demanded significant resources and coordination, driving the centralization of political authority within city-states and setting the stage for even larger conflicts to come. But the real game-changer was the vast trade networks that connected these Mesopotamian powerhouses with civilizations across the known world. Merchants established permanent trading posts in regions so distant that the journey alone would have been considered impossible by earlier generations. These weren't simple buying and selling expeditions. They were complex commercial operations that spread cultural practices, technological innovations, and administrative techniques across continents. Cuneiform tablets discovered at Kanesh in Anatolia provide fascinating insights into these ancient business networks. Mesopotamian merchant communities operated credit systems sophisticated enough to impress modern bankers, maintaining regular correspondence with their home cities, and managing commercial relationships that spanned thousands of miles. These documents reveal business practices so advanced that they wouldn't seem out of place in today's global economy. The wealth flowing through these trade networks enabled something unprecedented: the emergence of court cultures so elaborate and sophisticated that they redefined what it meant to be powerful. Royal workshops produced luxury goods that were essentially ancient status symbols: decorated weapons, exquisite jewelry, and ceremonial objects that displayed ruling elite sophistication in ways that could be understood across cultural boundaries. These material displays served crucial political functions beyond mere vanity. They legitimized royal authority through visible demonstrations of divine favor and economic success, while facilitating diplomatic relationships between city-states. In a world without mass media, luxury goods became the primary method of political communication, sending messages about power and prestige that could travel farther than armies. Agricultural intensification during this period created the economic foundation supporting everything else. Urban populations were growing rapidly, requiring food surpluses that also funded military campaigns, monumental construction projects, and those extensive trade networks. Sophisticated irrigation systems, including canals, levees, and storage reservoirs, enabled farmers to cultivate previously marginal lands, essentially creating agricultural wealth from barren landscapes. Administrative texts reveal management systems so complex they required professional bureaucracies to operate effectively. Water rights coordination, seasonal labor management, and agricultural product distribution demanded bureaucratic sophistication that many modern governments would struggle to match. These systems created the economic surpluses that transformed regional city-states into international powers. The social structures crystallizing during this period established patterns that would define Mesopotamian civilization for millennia. A tiny elite consisting of royal families, high priests, and wealthy merchants controlled vast resources, while the majority lived as farmers, artisans, and laborers with severely limited political rights. Slavery, initially involving prisoners of war, expanded to include individuals sold into bondage through debt or criminal punishment. These social hierarchies weren't maintained through goodwill. They were enforced through religious ideology, legal codes, and military force, creating societies that were remarkably stable despite being highly stratified. But this stability contained the seeds of something much larger, because the same organizational capabilities that managed city-states could theoretically manage something far more ambitious, an empire. And that's exactly what happened when a man emerged whose very name would become synonymous with imperial conquest. Sargon of Akkad, known in Akkadian as Sharuken, meaning legitimate king, rose from obscure beginnings to establish humanity's first multi-ethnic empire around 2334 BCE. His story, preserved across nearly 2 millennia in multiple ancient sources, presents historians with the fascinating challenge of separating historical reality from legendary embellishment. The most detailed account comes from the Neo-Assyrian Sargon birth legend, composed over 1,000 years after his death. According to this narrative, Sargon was born to a priestess forbidden from bearing children. She placed her infant son in a reed basket sealed with bitumen and set him adrift on the Euphrates River, where he was discovered by Akki, a royal gardener who raised the child as his own. This tale bears striking similarities to later heroic birth legends, including that of Moses, suggesting it may represent literary convention rather than historical fact. But archaeological evidence provides more grounded insights into Sargon's early career, revealing that he initially served as cupbearer to Ur-Zababa, king of Kish. The cupbearer position involved far more than beverage service. These officials functioned as trusted advisors, intelligence gatherers, and military commanders. Contemporary administrative texts suggest Sargon demonstrated exceptional organizational abilities and military acumen, gradually building a personal following among soldiers and administrators while serving at Kish. The political situation in mid-24th 3rd century BCE Mesopotamia created perfect conditions for ambitious military leaders. Lugalzage Seer of Umma had recently conquered Uruk and claimed dominion over southern Mesopotamia, but his control remained tenuous. Sumerian city-states resented foreign rule, while northern regions remained largely independent, creating a fragmented landscape ripe for exploitation by skilled commanders who could build coalitions against established powers. Sargon's break with Ur-Zababa occurred around 2340 BCE, though exact circumstances remain unclear. Later Akkadian sources claimed the aging king grew jealous of his cupbearer's influence and attempted assassination, prompting Sargon's rebellion. More likely, Sargon recognized that Ur-Zababa lacked the vision and resources for major territorial expansion, leading him to establish an independent power base in the region that would become known as Akkad. The location of Akkad itself remains one of archaeology's most persistent mysteries. Despite extensive excavations throughout central Mesopotamia, Sargon's capital remains unidentified. Textual evidence suggests strategic positioning along the Euphrates River, north of traditional Sumerian heartland, but south of later Assyrian territories, allowing control over trade routes connecting resource-rich northern regions with southern agricultural wealth. Recent archaeological surveys have identified several candidate sites between modern Baghdad and Babylon, but definitive identification awaits future excavation. The establishment of Akkad as imperial capital marked a fundamental departure from traditional Mesopotamian urban planning. Unlike Sumerian city-states that grew organically around ancient temple complexes, Akkad was designed specifically to serve imperial administrative functions, representing humanity's first purpose-built imperial capital. But Akkad wasn't just another city with a fancy name. It was humanity's first purpose-built imperial capital, and its design would blow your mind. Fragmentary texts reveal something revolutionary. massive royal palaces that dwarfed anything built before, extensive military barracks housing thousands of professional soldiers, and specialized workshops churning out weapons and luxury goods on an industrial scale. This wasn't accidental. Akkad's entire layout screamed royal authority over religious tradition, with the king's residence claiming the central position that had always belonged to temple complexes. Think about that shift for a moment. For over 1,000 years, Mesopotamian cities had organized themselves around gods and temples. Sargon flipped that script entirely, declaring that royal power was the new organizing principle of civilization. This wasn't just urban planning. It was a political revolution built in stone and brick. But Sargon's real genius lay in his military innovations, and these changes would transform warfare forever. Archaeological evidence from sites across Mesopotamia reveals technological advances that gave Akkadian forces devastating advantages over their enemies. The composite bow, constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, provided Akkadian archers with range and penetrating power that made traditional simple bows look like children's toys. These weren't weapons you could mass-produce in a village workshop. Composite bows required specialized manufacturing techniques and extensive training, pointing to something unprecedented in human history: the development of professional military units rather than the seasonal militia forces that earlier periods relied upon. Imagine the psychological impact on enemies who faced soldiers whose entire existence revolved around perfecting the art of war. The organization of Akkadian armies represented another revolutionary leap forward. Previous Mesopotamian warfare had operated like a part-time hobby. Citizen soldiers would fight during campaigns, then return to their farms and workshops between conflicts. Sargon shattered this model by establishing humanity's first professional standing army, maintaining thousands of soldiers in permanent military service. Cuneiform administrative texts describe logistical systems so sophisticated they would impress modern military planners. Standardized rations, equipment maintenance protocols, and medical care systems supported these forces across campaigns spanning thousands of miles. This military professionalization enabled sustained operations across vast distances, something absolutely impossible with traditional militia systems that needed to return home for harvest season. Siege warfare underwent equally dramatic advancement under Akkadian leadership. Archaeological excavations at sites destroyed during Sargon's campaigns reveal evidence of siege equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to earlier generations. Battering rams, scaling ladders, and earthwork fortifications combined with systematic approaches to reducing fortified cities that blended direct assault with blockade tactics designed to starve defenders into submission. These methods proved devastatingly effective against Sumerian city-states, whose defensive strategies remained frozen in an earlier era of limited warfare. It was like bringing fighter jets to a cavalry battle. The technological and tactical gap was simply insurmountable. The conquest of Lugal-Zaj Sea marked the beginning of Sargon's imperial expansion and demonstrated just how effective these military innovations could be. Contemporary inscriptions provide historians with rare detailed insight into ancient Mesopotamian warfare, revealing strategic thinking that would make modern generals nod with approval. Lugal-Zaj Sea had established his capital at Uruk after conquering much of southern Mesopotamia, but his empire remained essentially a loose confederation of tribute-paying city-states rather than a centrally administered territory. Sargon approached this challenge with characteristic brilliance, beginning his campaign with careful diplomatic preparation that exploited every weakness in his opponent's coalition. Akkadian agents contacted local rulers who resented Sumerian dominance, promising favorable treatment in exchange for support or neutrality. This strategy of exploiting ethnic and political divisions would become Sargon's signature approach throughout his reign. Archaeological evidence suggests several northern Mesopotamian cities opened their gates to Akkadian forces without resistance, having been promised continuation of their traditional privileges under imperial rule. The decisive battle occurred near Uruk around 2334 BCE. Though the exact location remains disputed among scholars, Sargon's forces approached from the north, forcing Lugal-Zaj Sea to abandon defensive positions and engage in open combat. The Akkadian army's superior archery and disciplined infantry formations proved absolutely decisive against Sumerian forces still organized according to traditional city-state military practices. Decomposite bows allowed Akkadian archers to maintain devastating fire at ranges where Sumerian simple bows proved useless, while professional soldiers maintained formation discipline under pressure that shattered militia units. It wasn't even close. This was systematic military superiority applied with surgical precision. Lugal's Age's capture marked the symbolic end of Sumerian political independence. Akkadian inscriptions describe how the defeated king was brought before Sargon in chains, then transported to Nippur, where he was forced to perform ritual submission before the god Enlil. This ceremony served both practical and symbolic functions, demonstrating Akkadian victory to potential resistors while claiming divine sanction for the new imperial order. The ritual also illustrated Sargon's sophisticated understanding of Mesopotamian political culture. Submission at Nippur carried particular significance due to the city's religious importance. This wasn't just military conquest. It was psychological warfare designed to break the spiritual foundation of resistance. Following Lugal's Age's defeat, Sargon systematically conquered the remaining Sumerian city-states. Each campaign demonstrated increasing sophistication in imperial administration alongside military technique. Rather than simply destroying conquered cities like a typical ancient conqueror, Sargon implemented policies designed to integrate Sumerian territories into a unified administrative system that could actually function. Local rulers who submitted voluntarily were often confirmed in their positions as imperial governors, while those who resisted faced replacement by Akkadian appointees. This wasn't mercy, it was calculated imperial policy that balanced control with efficiency. The Siege of Ur exemplified both Akkadian military capabilities and imperial policies in action. The city's massive walls and strategic location near the Persian Gulf made direct assault extremely costly, prompting Sargon to employ comprehensive blockade tactics that demonstrated engineering capabilities rivaling anything in the ancient world. Akkadian forces constructed elaborate siege works including earthwork ramparts and counter walls designed to prevent relief efforts. Contemporary texts describe how the siege lasted several months, with Akkadian engineers diverting water sources and disrupting trade routes until the city's population faced starvation. When Ur finally surrendered, Sargon demonstrated the calculated mixture of mercy and intimidation that would characterize Akkadian imperial policy. The city's walls were partially demolished to prevent future rebellion, but the population was spared and the local temple complex remained intact. The merchant class, crucial for maintaining Persian Gulf trade connections, received guarantees of protection for their commercial activities. These policies reflected Sargon's understanding that successful empire required economic prosperity alongside military dominance. The conquest of southern Mesopotamia established Akkadian control over the region's extensive irrigation systems, agricultural surpluses, and trade networks. Administrative texts from this period reveal implementation of standardized taxation systems with tribute flowing from conquered territories to support the imperial army and bureaucracy. Sargon appointed Akkadian governors to oversee major cities, while allowing local administrators to continue managing routine affairs. This hybrid system balanced imperial control with administrative efficiency, creating a governmental model that would influence subsequent Near Eastern empires for centuries. Military garrisons established throughout conquered territories ensured Akkadian dominance, while facilitating cultural integration. These installations housed not only soldiers but also administrators, craftsmen, and merchants who introduced Akkadian language and customs to local populations. Archaeological evidence reveals construction of standardized fortress designs across the empire, suggesting centralized military planning and engineering capabilities that operated like an ancient version of modern military standardization. These fortifications protected strategic locations, while serving as symbols of imperial power that reminded local populations of Akkadian military superiority. But they also functioned as cultural transmission centers, spreading Akkadian influence through daily interaction rather than simple intimidation. The rapid success of Sargon's conquests created unprecedented challenges in imperial administration. Traditional Mesopotamian political structures had evolved to govern individual city-states and their immediate territories, not vast multi-ethnic empires spanning hundreds of miles. Sargon and his advisors developed innovative solutions that combined Akkadian military organization with adapted Sumerian administrative practices. The result was a governmental system capable of managing diverse populations while maintaining central authority over strategic decisions. Communication networks became absolutely crucial for maintaining imperial unity across such vast distances. The Akkadians established humanity's first systematic courier system, with relay stations positioned at regular intervals along major trade routes. These stations provided fresh horses, supplies, and security for official messengers carrying imperial commands and provincial reports. It was essentially the ancient world's first postal service, designed specifically to hold an empire together through information flow rather than just military force. The efficiency was staggering. Clay tablets discovered at various sites reveal standardized formats for administrative correspondence, proving the development of bureaucratic procedures designed to ensure information flowed smoothly throughout this massive empire. This wasn't just good organization, it was the world's first systematic approach to managing a transcontinental superpower. With the Mesopotamian heartland firmly under Akkadian control, Sargon's ambitions exploded far beyond the traditional boundaries of Sumerian civilization. The consolidation of southern and central Mesopotamia had handed him resources that would make modern nations envious: vast agricultural surpluses, extensive trade networks, and a professional military force numbering in the tens of thousands. These assets enabled territorial expansion campaigns that would transform a regional Mesopotamian kingdom into something the world had never seen before. Humanity's first transcontinental empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The Zagros Mountains, forming Mesopotamia's natural eastern boundary, presented both incredible opportunities and formidable challenges for Akkadian expansion. These rugged highlands contained treasure troves of valuable mineral resources: copper, silver, and semi-precious stones that Mesopotamian craftsmen had imported for centuries through expensive intermediary merchants. More importantly, the mountain passes controlled access to the Iranian plateau and the wealthy Elamite cities beyond. Sargon recognized something that would make any business strategist nod with approval. Direct control over these routes would eliminate costly middlemen while providing strategic depth against potential eastern threats. It was ancient geopolitics at its most brilliant. The sophistication of Elamite civilization during the mid-3rd millennium BCE would have impressed even modern urban planners. Archaeological evidence from sites like Susa reveals cities that maintained extensive trade connections reaching into Central Asia and the Indus Valley, controlling the flow of luxury goods including lapis lazuli, carnelian, and exotic woods into Mesopotamia. Elamite administrative archives, written in their distinctive Proto-Elamite script, document complex bureaucratic systems managing agricultural estates, craft production, and long-distance commerce with efficiency that rivals modern corporations. The conquest of these territories would require not merely military victory, but the integration of established administrative structures into the expanding Akkadian imperial system, a challenge that would test every aspect of Sargon's governmental innovations. Sargon's initial campaigns into the Zagros region began around 2330 BCE, following the consolidation of Mesopotamian territories. The mountainous terrain demanded significant modifications to traditional Akkadian military tactics, which had proven devastatingly effective on Mesopotamia's flat plains, but faced serious limitations in highland warfare. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of treacherous terrain, requiring the establishment of fortified depots and the recruitment of local guides familiar with mountain passes. Contemporary administrative texts describe logistical challenges that would make modern military planners break out in cold sweats. Maintaining large armies in regions where local agriculture simply couldn't support substantial military forces. The siege of Susa demonstrated Akkadian adaptability in confronting urban centers, protected by both artificial fortifications and natural terrain advantages. The city occupied a strategic position controlling access to major trade routes, with massive walls constructed from locally quarried stone rather than the mud brick, typical of Mesopotamian cities. Akkadian siege engineers developed specialized techniques for reducing stone fortifications that showcased remarkable innovation under pressure. They used fire to weaken mortar joints and coordinated assaults targeting multiple wall sections simultaneously, tactics that wouldn't look out of place in medieval warfare centuries later. Cuneiform tablets from the period describe the construction of elaborate siege works, including wooden towers that allowed Akkadian archers to rain death down into the city, while remaining protected from defensive missiles. These weren't improvised solutions, they were systematic engineering approaches that demonstrated how quickly Akkadian military thinking could adapt to new challenges. The integration of conquered Elamite territories required administrative solutions so sophisticated they would influence imperial governance for centuries. Elamite cities had developed distinctive governmental structures centered around powerful temple complexes that managed both religious and economic affairs with remarkable efficiency. Rather than destroying these systems like a typical conqueror, Sargon's administrators adapted existing structures, appointing imperial governors who worked alongside traditional Elamite priests and administrators. This hybrid approach maintained local expertise in managing complex irrigation systems and trade relationships, while ensuring ultimate loyalty to Akkadian imperial authority. Linguistic diversity in the Eastern Territories presented unprecedented challenges for imperial administration. Elamite belonged to a language family completely unrelated to either Akkadian or Sumerian, requiring the training of specialized interpreters and the development of translation protocols for official communications. Archaeological discoveries of bilingual inscriptions from this period reveal systematic efforts to create administrative documents accessible to both Akkadian officials and local populations. These texts demonstrate the emergence of imperial bureaucratic practices designed to function across linguistic boundaries, establishing precedents that would influence subsequent Near Eastern empires for over a millennium. The wealth extracted from Elamite territories funded Sargon's subsequent campaigns, while demonstrating the economic benefits of imperial expansion to Akkadian elites. Tribute records describe regular shipments of precious metals, crafted goods, and exotic materials flowing from the eastern provinces to Akkad like rivers of ancient prosperity. This influx of wealth enabled the expansion of royal workshops, the construction of monumental architecture, and the maintenance of ever larger military forces. The economic integration of diverse territories created positive feedback loops that made further expansion both possible and profitable, essentially turning conquest into a self-funding business model. Sargon's northern campaigns into Anatolia represented an even more ambitious extension of Akkadian power, targeting regions that had never experienced Mesopotamian political control. The Anatolian plateau contained rich deposits of silver, copper, and iron ore that supplied metal workers throughout the Near East, while Anatolian cities controlled crucial trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with European markets and Black Sea resources. The conquest of these territories would provide the Akkadian Empire with direct access to metal resources, while eliminating the substantial costs of long-distance trade through independent intermediaries. It was economic warfare disguised as territorial expansion. The city of Profroshanda, located in central Anatolia, became a primary target for Akkadian expansion due to its role as a major commercial center. Archaeological excavations have revealed extensive merchant quarters containing tablets written in Old Assyrian, indicating the presence of Mesopotamian trading communities centuries before Sargon's conquests. These existing commercial connections provided invaluable intelligence about local political conditions, economic resources, and potential military threats. Akkadian merchants who had operated in Anatolian cities for generations served as guides, interpreters, and intelligence agents during the military campaigns, proving that sometimes the best spies are successful businessmen. The logistics of maintaining armies across the vast distances separating Mesopotamia from central Anatolia required innovations in military organization and supply management that pushed ancient capabilities to their limits. Traditional Mesopotamian armies had operated within relatively short distances of their home bases, allowing soldiers to return seasonally for agricultural work. Anatolian campaigns demanded year-round military service and the establishment of permanent supply lines across hundreds of miles of varied terrain. Administrative texts ascribe the creation of fortified supply depots positioned at strategic intervals, each staffed with administrators responsible for maintaining stockpiles of weapons, food, and other military necessities. This was essentially the ancient world's first systematic approach to long-distance military logistics, creating infrastructure that could sustain professional armies thousands of miles from home for extended periods. Akkadian forces encountered significantly different military challenges in Anatolia compared to their previous campaigns in Mesopotamia and the Zagros region. Anatolian cities relied heavily on cavalry forces and mobile tactics, rather than the infantry formations and siege warfare typical of Mesopotamian conflicts. This forced another dramatic adaptation in Akkadian military thinking, as they faced enemies who could strike quickly and disappear into difficult terrain, rather than standing behind city walls waiting for siege equipment to arrive. These weren't the predictable battles Akkadian forces had grown accustomed to. Local warriors exploited their superior knowledge of terrain to launch devastating hit-and-run attacks against Akkadian supply columns, forcing imperial commanders to completely rethink their approach to warfare. The adaptation of Akkadian military doctrine to counter these threats showcased the professional flexibility that made the empire's continued expansion possible, proving that even ancient superpowers had to constantly evolve or face defeat. The conquest of Anatolian territories brought the Akkadian Empire face to face with something unprecedented: Indo-European-speaking populations for the first time in recorded history. These encounters thrust Akkadian administrators into completely alien linguistic, cultural, and religious worlds that demanded entirely new approaches to imperial governance. Archaeological evidence reveals that Akkadian officials made systematic efforts to decode local customs and weave traditional Anatolian practices into imperial administrative frameworks. This cultural sensitivity wasn't just political correctness, it was survival strategy, proving crucial for maintaining long-term control over territories separated from the Mesopotamian heartland by vast distances and punishing terrain. The Western campaigns that brought Akkadian forces to the Mediterranean coast represented the absolute pinnacle of Sargon's territorial expansion and the creation of humanity's first transcontinental empire. The Levantine region contained commercial powerhouses that controlled maritime trade routes, linking Mesopotamia with Egypt, Cyprus, and the broader Mediterranean world. Conquering these territories would grant the Akkadian Empire access to cedar wood, purple dye, and other luxury goods, while establishing direct diplomatic relationships with major regional powers. This wasn't just about territory anymore. This was about creating a global empire that controlled the world's most valuable trade networks. The siege of Ebla, located in northern Syria, demonstrated the absolute peak of Akkadian military capabilities and imperial ambitions. This wealthy metropolis controlled extensive territories and maintained sophisticated diplomatic relationships with powers throughout the ancient Near East. The Ebla archives, discovered by archaeologists in the 1970s, contained thousands of cuneiform tablets documenting the city's extensive commercial and diplomatic activities during the period immediately before Sargon's conquest. These texts reveal a sophisticated urban civilization with complex governmental structures, international trade relationships, and cultural achievements that could match contemporary Mesopotamian cities. Ebla wasn't some backwater settlement. It was a major power center that represented everything the Akkadian Empire sought to control or eliminate. Akkadian forces approaching Ebla encountered defensive preparations that reflected the city's acute awareness of imperial expansion rolling toward them from the east. The inhabitants had reinforced existing fortifications, accumulated supplies for extended siege warfare, and negotiated military alliances with neighboring cities. Contemporary texts describe how Ebla's rulers attempted to organize regional resistance to Akkadian expansion, recognizing that imperial conquest would fundamentally shatter the existing balance of power throughout the Levant. These defensive measures forced Sargon's commanders to deploy their most sophisticated siege techniques and maintain massive armies in the field for extended periods. This wasn't a quick conquest, it was a grueling test of imperial resources and determination that would determine whether the Akkadian Empire could truly dominate the known world. The administrative integration of Levantine territories required the most complex governmental solutions, yet developed by Akkadian imperial administrators. These regions contained populations speaking various Semitic languages related to but distinct from Akkadian, along with Hurrian and other non-Semitic groups. Religious traditions varied dramatically between cities, with local deities and cult practices that bore little connection to Mesopotamian religious systems. Successfully integrating such diverse territories demanded administrative flexibility and cultural sensitivity that pushed imperial governmental structures to their absolute limits. This was empire building on a scale that tested every aspect of human organizational capability. The establishment of Akkadian garrisons throughout conquered territories served multiple functions beyond simple military domination. These installations became dynamic centers for cultural exchange, economic integration, and administrative coordination that gradually transformed the fundamental character of imperial territories. Archaeological excavations at sites like Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia have revealed extensive Akkadian military and administrative complexes that housed not only soldiers, but also craftsmen, merchants, and bureaucrats who introduced imperial practices to local populations. These weren't just military bases, they were transformation centers that slowly converted conquered territories into integral parts of the empire. Tel Brak, strategically positioned along major trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia and the Levant, became one of the most important Akkadian garrison cities. Excavations have uncovered massive administrative buildings containing thousands of cuneiform tablets documenting imperial governmental activities with mind-blowing detail. These archives reveal the day-to-day operations of imperial administration, including tax collection, military recruitment, judicial proceedings, and diplomatic correspondence. The scale and sophistication of these administrative activities demonstrate how Akkadian imperial government evolved to manage territories and populations far more diverse than anything previously attempted in human history. The garrison at Nagar, located in the Kabul River Valley, perfectly illustrates how Akkadian military installations facilitated economic integration across imperial territories. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive workshops producing standardized pottery, metalwork, and textiles according to imperial specifications that were distributed throughout the empire, creating common material cultures that transcended local ethnic and linguistic boundaries. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency systems enabled merchants to conduct business across vast distances without the constant headaches of converting between different local standards. This was ancient globalization in action, creating economic unity through systematic standardization. Economic integration through standardized systems represented one of the Akkadian Empire's most significant and lasting contributions to human civilization. Previous Mesopotamian city-states had developed their own distinctive systems for measuring grain, metals, textiles, and other commodities, creating massive barriers to long-distance trade. Merchants conducting business between different cities faced the constant nightmare of converting between incompatible measurement systems, often leading to disputes and additional transaction costs that crushed the profitability of commercial activities. Sargon's administrators recognized that imperial unity required economic standardization, leading to the implementation of uniform weights and measures throughout Akkadian territories. Archaeological discoveries of standardized stone weights from sites across the empire demonstrate the systematic nature of this revolutionary reform. These weights, marked with cuneiform inscriptions indicating their official values, enabled merchants to conduct transactions with complete confidence regardless of their location within imperial boundaries. The standardization eliminated previous sources of commercial uncertainty while facilitating the explosive growth of long-distance trade networks that connected diverse regional economies into a single imperial system. This was economic engineering on a scale that wouldn't be matched for centuries. The development of standardized currency systems complemented measurement reforms and further accelerated economic integration. While true coinage wouldn't appear in the Near East for another millennium, Akkadian administrators established conventional values for silver and barley that functioned as imperial currency standards. Cuneiform tablets from across the empire record transactions using these standardized values, enabling complex commercial relationships that spanned vast distances. The ability to conduct business using universally recognized standards reduced transaction costs while encouraging economic specialization and regional trade that created unprecedented prosperity. The integration of diverse populations speaking different languages created unprecedented challenges for imperial administration that demanded innovative solutions that would influence governance for millennia. The Akkadian Empire encompassed speakers of Sumerian, Akkadian, Elamite, Hurrian, and various other languages, each with distinct cultural traditions and governmental expectations. Successful imperial administration demanded the development of communication systems that could function across these linguistic boundaries, while respecting local customs and traditions. This wasn't just about conquest anymore, it was about creating functional unity from incredible diversity. Akkadian gradually emerged as the empire's administrative lingua franca, but this process occurred through practical necessity rather than imposed cultural uniformity. The empire needed a common language for administration, and Akkadian filled that role naturally as the language of the imperial court and military command. The reality was undeniable. Administrative efficiency demanded common languages for official communications, legal proceedings, and military commands that could function across this incredibly diverse empire. Akkadian status as the language of the imperial court and military naturally propelled its adoption by local elites who recognized that career advancement within imperial governmental structures required linguistic adaptation. Archaeological evidence reveals that bilingual education became standard practice in garrison cities and administrative centers, creating an entire class of officials capable of operating seamlessly in both local and imperial linguistic contexts. This wasn't just practical necessity, it was cultural evolution in real time, as the empire created new forms of human identity that transcended traditional ethnic boundaries. The development of imperial governance structures capable of managing such staggering linguistic and cultural diversity represented a fundamental breakthrough in human political organization. Previous governmental systems had evolved to manage relatively homogeneous populations sharing common languages, religious traditions, and cultural practices. The Akkadian Empire's success in governing incredibly diverse populations established precedents and administrative techniques that would influence imperial governance throughout subsequent history, proving that effective political unity could transcend ethnic and linguistic boundaries through sophisticated administrative practices and cultural sensitivity. This was political science being invented in real time. But every empire faces its ultimate test, and for the Akkadians that moment arrived with devastating suddenness. The death of Sargon around 2279 BCE precipitated the first major succession crisis in imperial history, exposing fundamental weaknesses in Akkadian governmental systems that would plague Near Eastern empires for millennia to come. Unlike the established hereditary monarchies of individual city-states, where succession protocols had evolved over centuries of political development, the Akkadian Empire lacked institutional mechanisms for managing imperial transitions. Sargon's vast conquests had created an unprecedented political entity, but the administrative structures necessary for stable succession remained dangerously underdeveloped when the great conqueror died after ruling for an extraordinary 56 years. Contemporary cuneiform sources provide fragmentary but absolutely illuminating glimpses into the immediate chaos following Sargon's death. Administrative tablets from Gersu and Umma record the sudden cessation of regular tribute payments to Akkad, while military dispatches describe garrison commanders desperately requesting reinforcements to maintain order in their territories. The imperial communication network, so crucial for maintaining unity across vast distances, began experiencing systematic disruptions as local officials questioned the authority of imperial commands issued by an untested new ruler. This was the ancient equivalent of a government-wide communications breakdown, and the consequences were immediate and terrifying. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tel Brak reveals hasty repairs to fortification walls during this period, suggesting that garrison commanders anticipated serious military challenges to imperial authority. These weren't routine maintenance projects. These were panic preparations by officials who could sense the empire beginning to fracture around them. Rimush, Sargon's son and designated successor, faced immediate challenges that would test both his personal capabilities and the fundamental resilience of imperial institutions. The young king inherited an empire stretching from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean coast, encompassing dozens of conquered cities and numerous ethnic groups with extremely limited loyalty to Akkadian rule. Many of these territories had been incorporated into the empire within living memory, meaning substantial portions of the population retained vivid cultural memories of political independence and harbored deep resentments against imperial taxation and military conscription. This wasn't ancient history to them. This was their parents' and grandparents' lost freedom, and Sargon's death looked like their opportunity for revenge. The Sumerian cities of southern Mesopotamia presented the most immediate and dangerous threat to Rimish's authority. These ancient urban centers had maintained their distinctive cultural identities despite decades of Akkadian rule, and their populations included significant numbers of priests, merchants, and administrators who had held prominent positions before Sargon's conquests. The transition period following Sargon's death provided these groups with golden opportunities to reassert traditional political autonomy while challenging the legitimacy of continued imperial control over their territories. They had been waiting for this moment, and they weren't going to waste it. Urs emerged as the focal point of Sumerian resistance, with its ruler Kaku boldly declaring independence from Akkadian authority and calling upon other Sumerian cities to join a coordinated rebellion. This wasn't an impulsive decision. Archaeological excavations at Ur have revealed evidence of extensive military preparations during this period, including the construction of additional defensive works and the systematic stockpiling of weapons in temple complexes. Cuneiform tablets from the city's archives document intensive diplomatic correspondence with other Sumerian centers, revealing systematic efforts to organize regional resistance against Rimish's forces. These documents read like ancient revolutionary planning sessions, with detailed coordination of rebellion strategies that would make modern resistance movements proud. The rebellion spread like wildfire throughout the Sumerian heartland, with cities like Umma, Adab, and Kazalu declaring their independence and violently expelling Akkadian governors. Administrative records from Dursu describe the brutal massacre of imperial tax collectors, while similar incidents erupted at multiple sites across southern Mesopotamia. These coordinated uprisings demonstrated both the extent of anti-Akkadian sentiment that had festered during Sargon's reign and the impressive organizational capabilities of Sumerian political and religious leaders, who had maintained clandestine networks despite imperial surveillance. The empire's subjects had been planning this rebellion for years, just waiting for the right moment to strike. Rimish's response to these revolts revealed both the impressive strengths and critical limitations of the imperial military system he had inherited from his father. The professional Akkadian army remained loyal and maintained its technological advantages over traditional city-state militias, but the simultaneous nature of multiple rebellions stretched imperial resources to their absolute breaking point. Military commanders faced the nightmare scenario of conducting siege operations against fortified cities, while maintaining control over territories containing potentially hostile populations, sympathetic to the rebels. This was military multitasking on a scale that would challenge even modern armies. The siege of Ur became the decisive engagement that would determine the fate of Sumerian independence movements, and possibly the survival of the entire empire. Rimishu personally commanded the imperial forces, recognizing that failure to suppress the rebellion would likely trigger additional uprisings throughout the empire that could tear his inherited kingdom apart. Contemporary military records describe the deployment of the full range of Akkadian siege techniques, including the construction of massive earthwork ramps designed to overtop the city's ancient walls. Engineers diverted water sources and established comprehensive blockades that prevented the delivery of supplies to the besieged population. The assault on Ur's defences required months of sustained effort, with Akkadian forces facing determined resistance from defenders who understood that defeat would likely result in severe retribution. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a struggle for the survival of Sumerian civilization itself. Archaeological evidence from the site reveals extensive fire damage dating to this period, suggesting that the final assault involved the systematic use of incendiary weapons to clear defensive positions. Cuneiform tablets discovered in the destruction layers describe the methodical demolition of sections of the city's walls, indicating that Akkadian engineers had developed sophisticated techniques for reducing even the most formidable fortifications. When Ur finally fell, Rimush implemented a policy of calculated brutality, specifically designed to discourage future rebellions throughout the empire. This wasn't random violence. It was psychological warfare intended to break the spirit of resistance across all imperial territories. The numbers are absolutely staggering and reveal the true brutality of ancient imperial warfare. Contemporary inscriptions record that over 8,000 defenders perished during the final assault on Ur, while an additional 5,400 prisoners were systematically executed in the aftermath of the city's capture. The scale of these casualties far exceeded anything typical in Mesopotamian warfare practices, representing a calculated strategy of intimidation rather than conventional military necessity. This wasn't just conquest, this was psychological warfare designed to terrorize potential rebels across the entire empire. Rimush's forces methodically destroyed significant portions of the city's infrastructure, including temples, administrative buildings, and residential quarters that had housed the rebellion's leadership. Every building that had supported resistance was marked for destruction, sending an unmistakable message about the price of defying imperial authority. The suppression of Ur's rebellion achieved exactly what Rimush intended. It sent crystal-clear messages to other Sumerian cities about the devastating consequences of challenging imperial authority. Archaeological evidence from sites like Umma and Ada reveals the immediate abandonment of defensive preparations and the rapid resumption of tribute payments to Akkad. Local rulers who had supported the rebellion vanished from power, replaced with loyal Akkadian appointees, while temple complexes that had served as resistance centers faced confiscation of their properties and dramatic reduction of their traditional privileges. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion meant complete annihilation. The systematic destruction of rebellious settlements extended far beyond Ur to encompass every center of Sumerian resistance. Kazalu, which had served as a crucial coordination point for rebel communications, faced particularly savage treatment that included the complete demolition of its walls and the forced relocation of substantial portions of its population. Administrative tablets from this period describe the organized transfer of skilled craftsmen and administrators from destroyed cities to Akkad and other loyal centers, representing an early example of the population transfers that would become standard practice in later Near Eastern empires. This was ethnic engineering on a massive scale, designed to permanently break the back of Sumerian resistance. These harsh suppression measures achieved their immediate objective of ending Sumerian resistance, but they also created devastating long-term problems for imperial administration. The destruction of established urban centers completely disrupted economic networks that had contributed significantly to imperial revenues, while the elimination of experienced local administrators created massive gaps in governmental capabilities that proved extremely difficult to fill. Archaeological surveys of southern Mesopotamia reveal significant population decline during Rimush's reign, suggesting that the brutal suppression of revolts had fundamentally damaged the region's economic foundations. The cure had nearly killed the patient. The empire had survived, but at an enormous cost to its productive capacity. The transition from Rimush to his brother Meneshtusu, around 2270 BCE, occurred under circumstances that remain partially shrouded by incomplete historical records, though contemporary sources strongly suggest that Rimush's death resulted from a palace conspiracy rather than natural causes. Administrative tablets from Akkad describe highly unusual security measures implemented during the final months of Rimush's reign, including severe restrictions on access to the royal palace and the assignment of additional guards to protect key officials. These precautions indicate acute awareness of internal threats, though they ultimately proved insufficient to prevent the king's assassination. Even successful tyrants, it seems, eventually faced the consequences of their brutality. Meneshtusu inherited an empire that had survived its first major succession crisis, but faced ongoing challenges related to administrative efficiency, economic recovery, and military security that would test every aspect of his leadership abilities. The new king's reign would be characterized by efforts to consolidate imperial gains while developing more sophisticated governmental structures capable of managing the complex territories that Sargon had conquered. Unlike his brother's focus on military suppression, Menishtusu emphasized economic development and administrative reform as more sustainable means of strengthening imperial unity. This represented a fundamental shift in imperial strategy, from rule through fear to rule through prosperity. The new king's most significant initiatives involved securing and expanding the trade networks that provided much of the empire's wealth. Mesopotamian prosperity had always depended heavily on long-distance commerce, but the creation of a transcontinental empire offered unprecedented opportunities for controlling and profiting from international trade routes. Menishtusu recognized something his brother had missed. Economic prosperity would provide far more sustainable foundations for imperial unity than the military intimidation that had characterized the previous approach to governance. Fear might work in the short term, but wealth could buy loyalty that lasted generations. Maritime trade across the Persian Gulf became a particular focus of Menishtusu's revolutionary commercial policies, as these routes provided access to luxury goods and raw materials that simply couldn't be obtained through overland commerce. The kingdoms of Magan and Melihar, located in present-day Oman and the Indus Valley respectively, controlled sources of copper, precious stones, and exotic woods that Mesopotamian craftsmen absolutely required for producing luxury goods. Previous trade relationships had operated through independent merchants who charged substantial markups for their services, dramatically reducing the profits available to imperial workshops and treasuries. Menishtus decided to eliminate the middlemen entirely through direct imperial control of these lucrative trade routes. Menishtusu's naval expeditions across the Persian Gulf represented absolutely unprecedented ventures in Mesopotamian maritime history. Traditional Mesopotamian vessels had been designed for river navigation rather than open sea voyages, requiring significant technological innovations to enable long-distance maritime commerce. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Persian Gulf coast reveals the construction of specialized shipyards during this period, equipped with facilities for building vessels capable of carrying substantial cargo loads across hundreds of miles of treacherous open water. This was ancient naval engineering at its most ambitious. The development of Akkadian naval capabilities required expertise that simply didn't exist within traditional Mesopotamian technological traditions. Imperial administrators recruited shipbuilders and navigators from coastal populations who possessed the specialized knowledge necessary for maritime construction and navigation. Cuneiform tablets from Akkad describe the establishment of comprehensive training programs designed to teach Akkadian personnel the skills required for naval operations, including celestial navigation, weather prediction, and ship maintenance techniques. This was essentially the world's first naval academy, created to project imperial power across the seas. The first major naval expedition to Magan achieved remarkable success, establishing direct diplomatic and commercial relationships with rulers who had previously dealt with Mesopotamian merchants only through expensive intermediaries. Contemporary inscriptions describe the acquisition of substantial quantities of copper ore, diorite stone, and precious metals that were transported back to Akkad for use in imperial workshops. These materials enabled the production of luxury goods that enhanced the prestige of the imperial court, while generating enormous revenues through export to other regions. The expedition had essentially created a new economic engine for the empire. The expedition to Melihar proved even more significant for imperial economic development, as it established direct access to the sophisticated commercial networks of the Indus Valley civilization. Archaeological discoveries at Harpan sites have revealed Akkadian artifacts dating to this period, indicating successful diplomatic and commercial relationships between these distant civilizations. The goods obtained through this trade included carnelian beads, ivory carvings, and cotton textiles that commanded astronomical prices in Mesopotamian markets. These maritime commercial successes enabled Menishtusu to implement significant administrative reforms designed to dramatically improve imperial governmental efficiency. The wealth generated through direct trade relationships provided resources for expanding the imperial bureaucracy, establishing additional administrative centers, and developing more sophisticated record-keeping systems. Archaeological excavations at sites throughout the empire have revealed standardized administrative buildings constructed during this period. indicating systematic efforts to improve governmental capabilities across all territories. The development of Akkadian legal and administrative texts reached new levels of sophistication during Manishtusu's reign, reflecting both the increasing complexity of imperial governance and the growing confidence of Akkadian administrators in managing incredibly diverse populations. These documents reveal systematic efforts to codify legal procedures, standardize administrative practices, and establish clear precedents for resolving disputes that arose within the empire's diverse territories. The legal innovations developed during this period would influence Mesopotamian jurisprudence for centuries to come, creating institutional foundations that would outlast the empire itself. Interests and imperial requirements. They weren't just creating property laws, they were engineering an entirely new social order. What made these documents truly groundbreaking was their incredible attention to detail. Every single property transaction required witness testimony, official registration, and payment of transfer taxes to imperial authorities. Think about that for a moment. Over 4,000 years ago, ancient administrators were already implementing the kind of bureaucratic procedures that modern governments still use today. Archaeological discoveries across the empire show these weren't isolated experiments, but part of a massive coordinated legal revolution. The impact on society was absolutely staggering. For the first time in human history, successful merchants, skilled administrators, and decorated military officers could accumulate genuine wealth through land ownership. This created entirely new social classes that didn't depend on ancient bloodlines or religious connections. Instead, their power came from serving the empire effectively. It was meritocracy in action, and it fundamentally changed how people thought about success and social mobility. But here's what's really clever about this system. It actually strengthened imperial unity rather than fragmenting it. These new landowners had everything to lose if the empire collapsed, so they became the most devoted supporters of political stability. It was brilliant social engineering disguised as property law. Meanwhile, commercial law was experiencing its own revolution. Imperial administrators faced an enormous challenge. How do you regulate trade relationships spanning thousands of miles between people who spoke different languages and followed different customs? The answer came in the form of standardized commercial codes discovered on cuneiform tablets from trading centers like Kanesh in Anatolia. These weren't simple trade agreements. They were sophisticated legal frameworks covering everything from contract terms to dispute resolution procedures and penalty assessments for commercial misconduct. Imagine trying to enforce a business deal between a Mesopotamian merchant and an Anatolian trader without modern communication or transportation. These legal innovations made it possible by creating predictable, reliable mechanisms for enforcing agreements across vast distances. The administrative sophistication during this period is mind-blowing when you really think about it. Provincial governors received detailed instruction manuals covering tax collection, military recruitment, judicial administration, and diplomatic protocols. We're talking about managing a transcontinental empire with technology that wouldn't seem out of place in a modern government handbook. Record-keeping systems underwent revolutionary improvements with standardized formats for correspondence, financial accounts, and legal proceedings. Archaeological discoveries of archive rooms throughout the empire reveal systematic approaches to document storage and retrieval that would make any modern librarian proud. Administrators could access information efficiently when making decisions or resolving disputes, crucial capabilities for maintaining unity across such diverse populations. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Despite all these administrative and economic achievements, Manishtushu's reign was plagued by the same deadly palace politics that had destroyed his brother. The concentration of power created opportunities for ambitious officials to advance through conspiracy and assassination rather than demonstrated competence. Palace intrigue became increasingly complex as competing factions fought for influence over imperial policy. The evidence for what ultimately led to Manishtushu's assassination around 2255 BCE is limited but absolutely chilling. Administrative tablets from his final years describe unusual personnel changes within the royal household. Long-serving officials suddenly dismissed and replaced by new administrators whose backgrounds suggested factional loyalties rather than administrative expertise. These changes paint a picture of growing tensions that may have contributed to the king's eventual murder. The assassination of both Rimush and Manishtushu within relatively short periods exposed fundamental weaknesses in early imperial succession systems that would plague Near Eastern empires for centuries. When ultimate authority rested in individual rulers, eliminating a single person could trigger massive political crises. The lack of institutional mechanisms for peaceful succession encouraged violent solutions to political competition. Then came Naram Sin's ascension to the Akkadian throne around 2254 BCE, marking not just another dynastic transition but the beginning of the most revolutionary and controversial reign in early imperial history. Unlike his predecessors who ruled as divinely appointed kings, Naram Sin would fundamentally transform Mesopotamian kingship by declaring himself a living god. This wasn't mere royal megalomania, it was a calculated response to the persistent succession crises and internal rebellions that had plagued the empire since Sargon's death. Contemporary cuneiform sources reveal that Naram Sin's assumption of divine status occurred gradually rather than through dramatic proclamation. Administrative tablets from Akkad dating to approximately 2250 BCE begin incorporating the divine determinative sign before the king's name, indicating his elevation above mortal status. This orthographic change represented profound theological innovation, as previous Mesopotamian rulers had been considered mortal intermediaries between gods and humans, never divine beings themselves. The religious establishment's response created complex political dynamics, requiring careful management to avoid widespread opposition. Traditional Mesopotamian theology maintained strict hierarchical distinctions between divine and mortal realms, with established priesthoods serving as intermediaries who interpreted divine will for human rulers. Naram Sin's assertion of personal divinity threatened these arrangements by eliminating the need for priestly mediation. Archaeological evidence from major temple complexes reveals systematic efforts to integrate imperial cult practices with existing religious traditions. Excavations at Nippur, the most sacred city in the Mesopotamian religious hierarchy, uncovered inscriptions describing Naram Sin as the beloved son of Enlil, effectively incorporating the deified king into the established pantheon rather than replacing traditional deities. This theological compromise allowed existing priesthoods to maintain their positions while acknowledging imperial divine authority, creating hybrid religious systems that balanced innovation with continuity. This transformation would echo through millennia of Near Eastern political development, establishing precedents that subsequent empires would both emulate and struggle against. The story of these ancient legal innovations and political upheavals reveals how human societies have always grappled with fundamental questions about property, power, and authority that remain relevant today. But declaring yourself a god is one thing, actually making it work in practice, that's where things get really complicated. Naram Sin couldn't just put on a fancy crown and call it a day. Divine kingship required completely restructuring how the entire empire operated, from the smallest legal procedures to the biggest diplomatic relationships. Think about it. When your king becomes a god, suddenly every oath, every ceremony, every military command has to change. Court officials scrambled to develop elaborate ceremonial practices that emphasized Naram Sin's divine nature, while somehow keeping the government functional enough to run a transcontinental empire. It's like trying to renovate your house while you're still living in it, except your house spans 3 continents and millions of people depend on it working perfectly. The most fascinating changes happened with loyalty, oaths. Cuneiform tablets from provincial archives reveal completely new oath formulas that required officials to swear allegiance not just to the imperial government, but to the divine person of Naram Sin himself. This wasn't just ceremonial, it created much more personal and theoretically unbreakable bonds of allegiance. Imagine the psychological impact of swearing loyalty to someone you literally believe is a god walking among mortals. But here's where it gets really interesting. Foreign relations became absolutely bizarre. Diplomatic correspondence from this period shows the incredible awkwardness of conducting international relations when one party claims divine authority while everyone else operates under normal political rules. Letters exchanged with Elamite and Anatolian rulers read like diplomatic comedy gold. You can practically feel the confusion and frustration. Some foreign courts took a diplomatic approach, accepting Akkadian divine kingship claims as internal Mesopotamian religious practices that didn't affect their own territories. Basically, they were saying, "You do you, but don't expect us to worship you." Others viewed these assertions with outright hostility, seeing them as threats to the entire established order of international relations. The military implications proved absolutely game-changing. Soldiers fighting under a divine commander could be convinced their cause enjoyed supernatural support, potentially skyrocketing morale and combat effectiveness during the toughest operations. Contemporary military dispatches described troops referring to their king as the god Naram-Sin, showing that divine status concepts had completely penetrated military culture at every level. This religious dimension of military service may have been crucial for what came next, because Naram-Sin's divine authority was about to face its ultimate test. What contemporary sources call the Great Revolt was brewing, and it would pose the most serious internal threat the empire had ever faced. Picture this: 9 major Mesopotamian cities simultaneously rising in coordinated rebellion. This wasn't some regional uprising that could be quickly crushed. This was systematic, empire-wide resistance that encompassed territories throughout the imperial heartland, including cities in northern Mesopotamia that had remained loyal since Sargon's original conquests. The scale and coordination suggested something terrifying for any ruler: systematic planning by opponents who viewed Naram-Sin's divine claims as fundamental violations of traditional Mesopotamian religious and political order. These weren't random riots. This was organized revolution. The rebellion began in Kish, whose rulers had maintained complex relationships with Akkadian authority since the very beginning. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive military preparations during Naram-Sin's early reign, additional defensive works, weapons stockpiled in temple complexes, the whole works. Cuneiform tablets discovered in destruction layers show sophisticated diplomatic correspondence between rebel leaders, revealing coordinated efforts to launch simultaneous uprisings that would stretch imperial forces beyond their capacity. Sippar emerged as another major rebellion center, with its powerful merchant class apparently viewing imperial divine cult requirements as threats to their traditional commercial relationships. The city's strategic location along major trade routes made its control absolutely crucial for maintaining imperial communications and supply lines. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Cutha, Kazalu, Marad, Akshak, Umusar, and all joined the coordinated resistance network. Each city brought different capabilities to the rebel coalition: naval expertise and Persian Gulf trade connections from some, crucial agricultural territories from others, strategic positions along communication routes from northern cities. This division of responsibilities showed sophisticated strategic planning that maximized each city's strengths while creating mutual dependencies, encouraging continued cooperation. The unprecedented challenges this posed for imperial forces cannot be overstated. Traditional Akkadian military doctrine had evolved around sequential campaigns against individual targets, allowing overwhelming force concentration against isolated opponents. But simultaneous rebellion required dividing imperial armies among multiple theaters, reducing the force concentrations that had previously ensured rapid victories. Naram-Sin's response demonstrated both inherited military capabilities and innovations, his divine status enabled. Rather than attempting to suppress all rebel cities simultaneously, imperial strategy focused on isolating and defeating key centers whose capture would disrupt rebel coordination networks. This required detailed intelligence about rebel communication systems and supply relationships, information imperial administrators had been systematically gathering through networks of loyal officials and merchants. The siege of Kish became the pivotal engagement determining the rebellion's fate. The city's ancient walls and strategic position made direct assault extremely costly, while its coordination role made capture essential for imperial success. Naram-Sin personally commanded the besieging forces, recognizing his divine status required visible leadership during the empire's greatest crisis. Contemporary inscriptions describe elaborate religious ceremonies conducted before the city's walls, designed to demonstrate divine support for imperial forces while undermining rebel morale through supernatural intimidation. This wasn't just military strategy, it was psychological warfare on a divine scale. Akkadian siege engineers deployed their most sophisticated techniques against Kish's fortifications, massive earthwork ramps, underground mining operations that tunneled beneath wall foundations to create controlled collapses. These weren't just military operations, they were engineering marvels requiring months of sustained effort by thousands of workers. When Kish finally fell after several grueling months, something unexpected happened. Instead of the brutal massacre everyone expected, Naram Sin implemented a policy of calculated mercy that completely changed the game. Unlike his predecessor Rimish's brutal suppression tactics, the divine king offered amnesty to common soldiers and citizens while reserving punishment only for rebellion leaders. This wasn't just royal kindness, it was brilliant strategy reflecting both practical military considerations and the theological implications of divine kingship. After all, gods were expected to demonstrate both justice and mercy in their dealings with mortal subjects. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating for the rebel coalition. The capture of Kish created cascading effects throughout the rebellion as other cities lost their primary coordination center, while witnessing the futility of resistance against divine authority. Archaeological evidence from sites like Sippar and Kutha reveals the hasty abandonment of defensive preparations and the resumption of tribute payments to Akkad. The rebellion was collapsing like dominoes. But here's what made Naram Sin's approach truly genius. Local rulers who had supported the rebellion were removed from power, but their replacements were often drawn from local populations rather than imposed Akkadian administrators. This demonstrated remarkable understanding that effective imperial governance required accommodating regional preferences and traditions rather than forcing uniform control. The suppression of the Great Revolt established Naram Sin's reputation as both a military commander and a divine ruler capable of overcoming the most serious challenges to imperial authority. Contemporary victory inscriptions describe the defeat in explicitly religious terms, attributing imperial success to the king's divine nature rather than purely military factors. These texts served crucial propaganda functions, reinforcing divine kingship concepts while warning potential rebels about the supernatural consequences of opposing divine authority. With internal rebellions crushed, Naram Sin could now pursue external campaigns that would extend Akkadian power into previously unconquered territories, while demonstrating the military capabilities that divine leadership provided. The most significant of these expeditions targeted the Lullaby people who inhabited the mountainous regions east of Mesopotamia. The Lullaby weren't pushover opponents. They controlled strategic mountain passes connecting Mesopotamia with the Iranian plateau, making their conquest essential for securing the empire's eastern frontiers. These mountain warriors possessed sophisticated military capabilities adapted to highland warfare, highly mobile infantry forces capable of devastating guerrilla operations against conventional armies. Their knowledge of local terrain provided massive advantages in defensive operations, while their decentralized political organization made decisive victories through capturing urban centers nearly impossible. Previous Mesopotamian campaigns against mountain peoples had achieved limited success due to logistical nightmares and the challenges of adapting lowland military tactics to highland terrain. Naram Sin's campaign required completely innovative military strategies combining traditional Akkadian siege techniques with new approaches designed specifically for mountain warfare. Imperial forces established fortified base camps at strategic valley locations, providing secure supply lines and staging areas for operations against Lullaby strongholds. These installations housed not only military personnel, but also engineers, craftsmen, and administrators necessary for maintaining complex operations in hostile territory over extended periods. The decisive engagement occurred at a mountain fortress whose exact location scholars still debate, though archaeological evidence suggests it controlled access to major trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Central Asian markets. Contemporary military records describe a complex assault involving coordinated attacks from multiple directions, preventing defenders from concentrating forces against any single threat. Akkadian engineers constructed elaborate siege works adapted to mountain terrain, wooden towers positioned on steep slopes and specialized equipment for reducing stone fortifications. The engineering challenges were staggering, but the results spoke for themselves. The victory over the lull provided Naram Sin with both practical strategic advantages and powerful propaganda opportunities, reinforcing his divine status. Control over mountain passes enabled direct imperial supervision of trade routes, bringing luxury goods from Central Asia and the Iranian plateau. More importantly, campaign success against formidable opponents in difficult terrain demonstrated the supernatural support that divine kingship provided. This victory was commemorated through creation of the Victory Stele of Naram Sin, representing one of the most significant artistic achievements of the Akkadian period and a masterpiece of ancient Near Eastern propaganda art. This limestone monument, standing over 6 feet tall, depicts the deified king leading troops up mountainous landscape while enemy warriors fall before his advance. The artistic composition emphasizes Naram Sin's divine status through multiple visual elements. He wears the horned crown, traditionally identifying gods in Mesopotamian art. His figure towers larger than surrounding humans, indicating supernatural status, and celestial symbols above suggest divine approval. The stela's artistic innovations extended beyond religious symbolism to include sophisticated techniques for representing three-dimensional space and narrative action. The mountain landscape rendered with unprecedented naturalism for Mesopotamian art, while human figure arrangements create movement and dramatic tension, drawing viewers into depicted events. These achievements reflected cultural confidence and technical capabilities that imperial patronage fostered, demonstrating how political success enabled artistic innovation. The accompanying inscription employs language explicitly emphasizing Naram Sin's divine nature while describing military achievements. The text refers to the king using divine determinatives and describes victory in terms suggesting supernatural intervention rather than purely human military skill. The stela's original placement at Sippar, one of the cities that participated in the Great Revolt, served important political functions beyond artistic display. The monument's presence in a formerly rebellious city provided constant reminders of imperial power while demonstrating consequences of opposing divine authority. Administrative reforms during Naram Sin's reign reflected both practical requirements of governing an expanded empire and theological implications of divine kingship. The appointment of royal daughters as high priestesses at major temples throughout imperial territories represented particularly significant innovation, combining religious authority with imperial administration. This wasn't just ceremonial window dressing. These appointments served multiple brilliant functions that would make any modern political strategist jealous. They provided direct imperial oversight of wealthy and politically influential temple institutions, created personal bonds between the royal family and regional religious establishments, and demonstrated the divine king's authority over traditional religious hierarchies. It was political genius disguised as religious appointment. The Princess Enhedawana, appointed as high priestess of the moon god Nana-Radur, exemplifies this sophisticated integration of imperial administration with religious authority. Archaeological excavations at have revealed extensive temple archives documenting her administrative activities, managing vast agricultural estates, supervising craft workshops, maintaining diplomatic correspondence with religious institutions throughout the empire. But here's what's absolutely fascinating. Her literary compositions, including hymns to various deities that survive in multiple copies, demonstrate how imperial religious appointments facilitated cultural integration across diverse territories. Think about the brilliance of this system. Similar appointments occurred at temples in Sippar, Babylon, and other major cities, creating networks of imperial religious authority that complemented traditional administrative structures. These princess priestesses possessed both the royal status necessary for commanding respect from local elites and the religious authority required for managing temple institutions effectively. They served as perfect intermediaries between imperial policies and local traditions, facilitating the cultural integration that strengthened long-term imperial unity. The standardization of imperial cult practices across the empire represented another crucial administrative innovation that reinforced divine kingship, while accommodating regional religious traditions. Rather than imposing uniform religious practices that might have triggered massive resistance, Naram-Sin's administrators developed flexible systems that incorporated imperial divine cult elements into existing local religious frameworks. Archaeological evidence from temple sites throughout the empire reveals the construction of shrines dedicated to the deified king alongside traditional local deities, creating hybrid religious systems that balanced imperial requirements with regional preferences. This wasn't religious conquest, it was religious diplomacy at its finest. These cult standardization efforts required sophisticated coordination between imperial administrators and local religious authorities. Cuneiform tablets from various provincial centers document the development of ceremonial protocols that incorporated prayers for the divine king into traditional religious festivals, creating regular opportunities for reinforcing imperial loyalty through religious observance. The timing and content of these ceremonies were carefully calibrated to complement rather than compete with established religious practices, demonstrating the cultural sensitivity that successful imperial administration required. It's like perfectly orchestrating a symphony where every instrument plays its part without drowning out the others. The economic implications of divine kingship extended throughout imperial territories, as the deified ruler's supernatural status justified expanded taxation and labor conscription for imperial projects. Administrative records from this period reveal significant increases in tribute requirements, with provincial governors instructed to collect additional resources for supporting expanded court ceremonies and monumental construction projects that divine status required. These increased fiscal demands were justified through religious arguments, emphasizing the supernatural benefits that divine protection provided to imperial subjects. Essentially, people were paying higher taxes for divine insurance coverage, and many apparently believed it was worth it. The construction of the palace of Naram-Sin at Tel Brak represented the most ambitious architectural project of the Akkadian period, and a physical manifestation of divine kingship concepts. This massive complex, covering several acres in the heart of one of the empire's most important garrison cities, combined residential, administrative, and ceremonial functions within unified architectural design that emphasized royal divine status. Archaeological excavations have revealed sophisticated construction techniques, fired brick for important structural elements, elaborate drainage systems enabling the complex to function effectively in northern Mesopotamia's challenging climate. The palace's throne room, measuring over 130 feet in length, provided space for the elaborate ceremonies that divine kingship required while demonstrating imperial wealth and power to visiting dignitaries. The walls were decorated with elaborate murals depicting the king receiving tribute from subject peoples, conducting religious ceremonies, and leading military campaigns. These artistic programs served both decorative and propaganda functions, creating environments that reinforced imperial ideology while providing impressive settings for diplomatic and administrative activities. The palace complex also housed extensive administrative facilities, including archive rooms containing thousands of cuneiform tablets documenting imperial governmental activities. These archives reveal the day-to-day operations of imperial administration during the height of Akkadian power, providing unprecedented insight into the practical mechanisms through which divine kingship was implemented across vast territories. The establishment of divine kingship under Naram-Sin created unprecedented conditions for cultural exchange and artistic innovation throughout the Akkadian Empire. The deified ruler's supernatural authority legitimized systematic integration of diverse cultural traditions while providing resources and patronage that enabled remarkable creative achievements. This period witnessed the emergence of a distinctive imperial culture that synthesized Sumerian religious practices, Akkadian linguistic innovations, and artistic traditions from conquered territories into coherent cultural forms that would influence Near Eastern civilization for millennia. We're talking about cultural fusion on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the Roman Empire. The fusion of Sumerian and Akkadian cultures occurred through complex processes extending far beyond simple political conquest or cultural imposition. Akkadian elites, recognizing Sumerian civilization's sophisticated achievements, systematically adopted and adapted existing religious practices, literary traditions, and artistic conventions while introducing their own cultural elements. This synthesis created hybrid cultural forms that maintained the theological sophistication and artistic refinement of Sumerian traditions, while incorporating the imperial ambitions and linguistic innovations characterizing Akkadian civilization. Religious integration represented the most fundamental aspect of this cultural synthesis, as successful imperial governance required harmonizing diverse theological traditions under unified imperial authority. The pantheon that emerged combined major Sumerian deities with Akkadian divine figures through complex theological arrangements, reflecting political realities while maintaining religious coherence. Enlil, the traditional Sumerian king of gods, retained his supreme position while accepting Naram-Sin as his divine son and earthly representative. Enlil, the powerful goddess of love and war, became identified with the Akkadian Ishtar, creating a unified divine figure whose worship extended throughout imperial territories. Temple institutions throughout the empire underwent systematic reorganization, balancing respect for traditional Sumerian religious practices with imperial administrative requirements. Archaeological excavations at major religious centers reveal construction of new shrine complexes dedicated to imperial cult practices, alongside existing facilities for traditional local worship. These architectural additions weren't just building projects, they created physical spaces where Sumerian and Akkadian religious traditions could coexist, while enabling imperial administrators to monitor and influence local religious activities through their control over combined temple complexes. It was brilliant social engineering disguised as architecture. The priesthood itself became increasingly integrated during this period, with Akkadian religious officials learning Sumerian liturgical languages, while Sumerian priests adapted their practices to accommodate imperial cult requirements. Imagine the cultural exchange happening in these temples, ancient languages being preserved and transmitted while new imperial practices were seamlessly woven into age-old traditions. Cuneiform tablets from temple archives document extensive correspondence between religious institutions across the empire, revealing systematic efforts to standardize ritual practices while preserving local variations that maintained regional religious identities. This careful balance between uniformity and diversity enabled the empire to achieve religious unity without triggering the resistance that more aggressive cultural impositions might have provoked. It's like creating a franchise system for religion, maintaining brand consistency while allowing local flavors. Akkadian elites demonstrated particular sophistication in their adoption of Sumerian literary traditions, recognizing that these cultural achievements provided both artistic inspiration and political legitimacy for imperial rule. The earliest versions of epic tales that would later influence works like the Epic of Gilgamesh began taking shape during this period through systematic collection and adaptation of Sumerian oral traditions. Picture this: Akkadian court scribes working alongside Sumerian literary specialists to create written versions of traditional narratives, while introducing new episodes that reflected imperial themes and values. They weren't just preserving ancient stories, they were actively reshaping them to support imperial ideology, while maintaining their literary power and cultural resonance. The development of royal inscriptions as propaganda tools represented a crucial innovation in Akkadian literary culture that combined Sumerian narrative techniques with imperial political requirements. These texts, carved on stone monuments and written on clay tablets for distribution throughout the empire, employed sophisticated literary devices to present imperial achievements in terms that emphasized divine sanction and supernatural support. The language of these inscriptions drew heavily on Sumerian religious and literary vocabulary, while introducing Akkadian grammatical structures and poetic conventions that created distinctive literary styles. Contemporary royal inscriptions reveal the emergence of standardized narrative formulas that presented imperial military campaigns, administrative achievements, and religious activities, according to consistent thematic patterns. These texts typically followed a specific formula: invocations of divine authority, detailed descriptions of royal accomplishments, and conclusions with promises of divine protection for loyal subjects and warnings of supernatural punishment for rebels. The repetitive structure served both practical and ideological functions, creating easily recognizable literary forms that reinforced imperial messages while providing scribes with flexible templates for producing new texts as circumstances required. The literary sophistication of Akkadian royal inscriptions extended far beyond simple propaganda to include complex narrative techniques, demonstrating advanced understanding of audience psychology and persuasive communication. The texts employed vivid descriptive language, enabling readers to visualize imperial achievements while using metaphorical imagery connecting political events with familiar religious and natural phenomena. These literary devices created emotional responses that strengthened intellectual arguments for imperial loyalty, demonstrating the cultural refinement that imperial patronage had fostered among Akkadian literary specialists. We're talking about ancient spin doctors who understood psychology better than most modern advertisers. Artistic innovations during the Akkadian period reflected the same synthetic approach, characterizing religious and literary developments, combining Sumerian iconographic traditions with imperial themes to create distinctive visual styles that communicated imperial ideology through sophisticated artistic means. Akkadian artists adopted the technical achievements of Sumerian craftsmen while introducing new subject matter and compositional approaches, reflecting the political realities and cultural ambitions of imperial civilization. This artistic synthesis produced works that maintained the aesthetic refinement of traditional Mesopotamian art, while incorporating innovative elements expressing imperial values and achievements. Sculpture during this period achieved unprecedented levels of technical sophistication and thematic complexity through combining traditional Mesopotamian carving techniques with new approaches to representing human figures and narrative scenes. The Victory Stele of Naram Sin exemplifies these achievements through masterful integration of religious symbolism, political propaganda, and artistic innovation within unified compositional design. The technical achievements evident in Akkadian sculpture reflect the resources and expertise that imperial patronage made available to artistic specialists. Royal workshops employed master craftsmen from throughout the empire, creating environments where different regional artistic traditions could interact and influence each other. Cylinder seals produced during the Akkadian period demonstrate particularly sophisticated integration of Sumerian iconographic traditions with imperial thematic content. These small carved stone cylinders used to authenticate documents and mark personal property required exceptional technical skill to create detailed narrative scenes within extremely limited space. Akkadian seal carvers developed innovative compositional techniques, enabling them to incorporate complex mythological narratives, royal propaganda themes, and personal identification elements within unified artistic designs that functioned effectively as both practical tools and artistic achievements. The iconographic programs employed on Akkadian cylinder seals reveal systematic efforts to create visual vocabularies that could communicate imperial ideology to diverse audiences throughout the empire. Traditional Sumerian mythological scenes were adapted to include references to imperial achievements, while new compositional arrangements emphasized the divine authority of Akkadian rulers. Metalwork during the Akkadian period achieved remarkable technical and artistic sophistication through combining traditional Mesopotamian crafting techniques with access to raw materials and artistic influences from throughout the empire. Imperial control over trade routes provided Akkadian metalworkers with unprecedented access to copper from Magan, silver from Anatolia, and gold from various sources, enabling production of luxury objects displaying both technical mastery and artistic refinement. The bronze work produced in imperial workshops demonstrates particular innovation in both decorative techniques and functional design. Akkadian metalworkers developed sophisticated methods for creating elaborate surface decorations, combining traditional Mesopotamian motifs with new design elements reflecting imperial themes and artistic influences from conquered territories. These decorative programs weren't just pretty designs. They often incorporated religious symbolism that emphasized imperial divine authority, while displaying the technical virtuosity that demonstrated the cultural achievements of Akkadian civilization. Every decorative element served a dual purpose: artistic beauty and political messaging. Weapons and military equipment produced during this period reveal the fascinating integration of practical military requirements with artistic ambitions reflecting the cultural values of imperial elites. Ceremonial weapons intended for royal use employed precious metals and elaborate decorative programs that transformed functional military equipment into artistic objects, suitable for diplomatic gifts and religious ceremonies. These luxury weapons served crucial political functions by demonstrating imperial wealth and cultural sophistication to foreign dignitaries, while providing physical symbols of divine royal authority that reinforced imperial ideology through material display. Imagine receiving a sword so beautifully crafted, it's basically a work of art, that's soft power at its finest. Now let's talk about one of the most remarkable individuals in this entire story, Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon and high priestess of Nana-Adda. Her unique position as both imperial princess and religious authority enabled her to bridge the cultural gap between Akkadian political traditions and Sumerian religious practices, while creating literary works that established precedents for centuries of subsequent Near Eastern literature. Archaeological excavations at Su have revealed extensive archives documenting her administrative activities, which included managing vast temple estates, supervising religious ceremonies, and maintaining correspondence with religious institutions throughout the empire. But here's what makes her truly extraordinary. Enheduanna's literary compositions, including hymns to various deities that survive in multiple copies from different periods, demonstrate sophisticated integration of Sumerian religious traditions with Akkadian linguistic innovations and imperial thematic content. Her hymns to Inanna employ traditional Sumerian religious vocabulary and mythological references, while introducing new theological concepts that reflected the political realities of imperial rule. These works created literary precedents for expressing complex theological ideas through poetic language that combined emotional intensity with intellectual sophistication. She wasn't just writing religious poetry, she was creating an entirely new literary tradition. The preservation and transmission of Enheduanna's literary works throughout subsequent centuries indicates their fundamental importance for Near Eastern cultural development. Copies of her compositions have been discovered at sites throughout Mesopotamia, dating from the Akkadian period through the Neo-Babylonian era, demonstrating their continued relevance for religious and literary traditions long after the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Enheduanna's innovations in literary technique extended beyond religious poetry to include the development of personal literary voice and autobiographical narrative elements that would influence subsequent Near Eastern literature. Her compositions frequently employ first-person narrative perspectives that present religious experiences through individual consciousness rather than impersonal theological discourse. These literary techniques created more emotionally engaging religious texts, while establishing precedents for personal religious expression that would characterize much subsequent devotional literature. She essentially invented the personal spiritual memoir thousands of years before anyone else thought to do it. The educational systems that developed during the Akkadian period played crucial roles in transmitting the cultural synthesis that imperial policies had created, while training the administrative and religious personnel necessary for maintaining imperial unity. Archaeological excavations at major urban centers have revealed school buildings and educational archives, documenting systematic approaches to training scribes in both Sumerian and Akkadian languages. The bilingual nature of Akkadian education represented a fundamental innovation that enabled systematic preservation and transmission of Sumerian cultural achievements, while facilitating their integration with Akkadian innovations. Students learned to read and write both cuneiform Sumerian and Akkadian, developing linguistic capabilities enabling them to function effectively in administrative and religious contexts requiring knowledge of both cultural traditions. Literary education emphasized memorization and copying of traditional texts, while encouraging creative adaptation and innovation reflecting contemporary political and religious requirements. Students learned classical Sumerian literary works while producing new compositions employing traditional techniques to address current themes and concerns. The cultural synthesis achieved during the Akkadian period established foundations for Near Eastern civilization that would persist for millennia after the empire's political collapse. The integration of Sumerian and Akkadian traditions created cultural forms that combined the sophisticated achievements of both civilizations while introducing innovations reflecting the unique requirements and opportunities of imperial governance. But underlying all these cultural achievements was something equally impressive: the economic infrastructure that sustained the Akkadian Empire, represented one of humanity's first experiments in managing transcontinental commerce and resource distribution on an unprecedented scale. The empire's survival depended not merely on military conquest and administrative control, but on sophisticated economic systems that could generate sufficient wealth to fund imperial armies, bureaucracies, and monumental construction projects. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the former Akkadian territories reveals the complexity of these economic arrangements, which integrated local production systems with long-distance trade networks spanning from the Indus Valley to Anatolia. We're talking about a Bronze Age version of global commerce that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. Akkadian control of major trade routes fundamentally transformed the economic geography of the ancient Near East by eliminating the fragmented political boundaries that had previously complicated long-distance commerce. Under the city-state system that preceded imperial unification, merchants conducting business between distant regions faced numerous political jurisdictions, each with distinct taxation systems, legal codes, and currency standards. Picture this: a trader carrying goods from Mesopotamia to Anatolia might encounter a dozen different political authorities, each demanding tribute payments, customs duties, and compliance with local commercial regulations that varied significantly between territories. It was a bureaucratic nightmare that made long-distance trade incredibly risky and expensive. Imperial unification under Akkadian rule created for the first time in recorded history a single political authority controlling trade routes from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. This economic revolution would have consequences that extended far beyond the empire's political boundaries. This political integration enabled the implementation of standardized commercial practices across vast distances, while eliminating many of the transaction costs that had previously made long-distance trade barely profitable. We're talking about creating the ancient world's first truly integrated economy, and the results were absolutely mind-blowing. Archaeological discoveries of merchant archives from sites like Kanesh in Anatolia and Susa in Elam document the sophisticated commercial relationships that developed under imperial protection, revealing trade networks of remarkable complexity and geographic scope. These aren't just simple "I'll trade you this for that" arrangements. These were complex business operations that would impress modern multinational corporations. The merchant archive discovered at Kanesh provides particularly detailed insight into Akkadian commercial practices and the mechanisms through which imperial control facilitated long-distance trade. These cuneiform tablets, numbering in the thousands, document the activities of Mesopotamian merchants who established permanent trading posts in Anatolian cities during the height of Akkadian power. Here's what's absolutely fascinating. The correspondence reveals sophisticated credit systems that enabled merchants to conduct business across thousands of miles without transporting large quantities of precious metals. This dramatically reduced both transportation costs and security risks associated with long-distance commerce. Imagine conducting international business without having to physically move bags of gold and silver across dangerous territories. That's exactly what they figured out how to do. These merchant documents describe complex partnership arrangements between Mesopotamian investors and local Anatolian traders, creating hybrid commercial enterprises that combined imperial capital with regional expertise. Mesopotamian partners typically provided initial investment capital and access to goods produced in imperial territories, while Anatolian associates contributed local market knowledge and established relationships with regional suppliers and customers. These partnerships enabled Akkadian merchants to penetrate local markets more effectively than would have been possible through purely external commercial relationships. It was like having local business partners in every major market, a strategy that modern global companies still use today. The goods documented in these commercial archives reveal the extraordinary diversity of products moving through Akkadian trade networks. Mesopotamian merchants exported textiles, crafted metalwork, and agricultural products including dates, barley, and processed foods, while importing raw materials including copper, silver, gold, and semi-precious stones that supplied imperial workshops and construction projects. The volume of these transactions, recorded in standardized units of measurement, indicates commercial activities on scales that absolutely dwarf earlier Mesopotamian trade relationships. We're talking about the ancient equivalent of container shipping. Massive, organized, systematic commerce. Archaeological evidence from Tel Brak, one of the empire's most important commercial centers, illustrates how Akkadian administrators developed infrastructure specifically designed to support large-scale commercial activities. Excavations have revealed extensive warehouse complexes capable of storing thousands of tons of goods, along with administrative buildings housing the bureaucratic personnel necessary for managing complex import and export operations. These facilities included specialized storage areas for different types of commodities, climate-controlled spaces for preserving textiles and organic materials, alongside secure vaults for precious metals and luxury goods. They were building Bronze Age distribution centers that wouldn't look out of place in a modern logistics operation. The standardization of weights and measures across imperial territories represented one of the Akkadian Empire's most significant contributions to commercial development and economic integration. Previous Mesopotamian city-states had developed their own distinctive measurement systems based on local agricultural practices and traditional craft production methods. These varied standards created substantial barriers to interregional trade as merchants faced the constant challenge of converting between incompatible measurement systems while negotiating transactions involving parties familiar with different commercial conventions. Imagine trying to do business when every city uses different measurements for the same products. It was a nightmare. Archaeological discoveries of standardized weights from sites throughout the former Akkadian Empire demonstrate the systematic nature of imperial measurement reforms. These stone and metal weights, marked with cuneiform inscriptions indicating their official values, have been found at locations spanning from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean coast. The consistency of these standards across such vast distances indicates centralized production and distribution systems that ensured uniform commercial practices throughout imperial territories. This wasn't just policy, it was systematic implementation on a scale that required incredible administrative coordination. The implementation of standardized measurements required extensive bureaucratic coordination and ongoing administrative oversight to ensure compliance with imperial standards. Cuneiform tablets from various administrative centers document the appointment of official inspectors responsible for verifying the accuracy of weights and measures used in commercial transactions. These officials possessed authority to confiscate non-standard equipment and impose penalties on merchants who attempted to use unauthorized measurement devices, creating enforcement mechanisms that maintained the integrity of imperial commercial standards. They had ancient quality control inspectors, making sure nobody was cheating the system. The development of standardized currency systems complemented measurement reforms and further facilitated economic integration across imperial territories. While true coinage wouldn't appear in the Near East for several more centuries, Akkadian administrators established conventional values for silver and barley that functioned as imperial currency standards. Administrative records from Girsu and other major commercial centers document the systematic implementation of these currency standards through official exchange rate tables, specifying the relative values of different commodities in terms of silver and barley equivalents. These tables were regularly updated to reflect changing market conditions while maintaining overall stability in exchange relationships. The emergence of merchant classes in major urban centers represented both a consequence and a driving force of imperial economic development. The expansion of long-distance trade created unprecedented opportunities for individual accumulation of wealth through commercial activities, leading to the development of professional merchant communities that possess substantial economic resources and political influence. Archaeological evidence from residential areas in cities like Ur and Babylon reveals the construction of elaborate private houses during the Akkadian period, indicating the prosperity that successful merchants achieved through participation in imperial trade networks. These merchant communities developed sophisticated business practices, enabling them to manage complex commercial operations across vast distances. Partnership agreements documented in contemporary archives reveal elaborate risk-sharing arrangements that distributed the costs and benefits of long-distance trade among multiple investors. These partnerships often included provisions for sharing losses due to theft, shipwreck, or political disruption, creating insurance-like systems that reduced individual risks while enabling larger-scale commercial ventures. The political influence of merchant classes grew substantially during the Akkadian period, as imperial administrators recognized their importance for maintaining economic prosperity and generating tax revenues. This created a new dynamic where economic success translated directly into political power, a pattern that would define civilizations for millennia to come. Merchants possessed detailed knowledge of market conditions, transportation routes, and political developments in distant regions, making them incredibly valuable sources of intelligence for imperial decision-making. Think about it. These traders were essentially the ancient world's first intelligence network, gathering information as they moved between territories and reporting back to imperial administrators. Additionally, their commercial networks provided channels for diplomatic communication and cultural exchange that complemented official imperial administrative systems. When formal diplomacy wasn't possible or practical, merchant relationships often kept communication lines open between different regions and political entities. Resource extraction from conquered territories represented a crucial component of imperial economic strategy, providing both raw materials for imperial workshops and tribute revenues that funded governmental operations. The systematic exploitation of mineral resources from regions like the Zagros Mountains and Anatolia enabled Akkadian craftsmen to produce luxury goods on unprecedented scales while generating surpluses that supported imperial military forces and administrative bureaucracies. Archaeological surveys of mining sites in territories incorporated into the Akkadian Empire reveal evidence of systematic extraction operations that employed sophisticated techniques for locating and processing mineral deposits. Copper mines in the Zagros region show signs of extensive development during the Akkadian period, with construction of permanent mining installations, including worker housing, processing facilities, and transportation infrastructure connecting remote mining sites with major trade routes. The organization of mining operations required substantial investments in specialized equipment and skilled personnel, indicating the massive resources that imperial authorities devoted to resource extraction activities. Contemporary administrative texts ascribe the appointment of imperial officials responsible for overseeing mining operations and ensuring regular shipments of extracted materials to central processing facilities. The tribute systems that channeled wealth from conquered territories to imperial centers represented another fundamental component of Akkadian economic organization. These systems built upon existing Mesopotamian practices of intercity tribute relationships, while expanding them to encompass the vast territories that imperial conquest had brought under Akkadian control. Tribute assessments were based on detailed surveys of regional economic capabilities that took into account local agricultural productivity, craft production capacity, and access to natural resources. Administrative tablets from sites like Susa and Tel Brak contain extensive inventories of regional economic assets, agricultural land assessments, livestock counts, and evaluations of local craft production capabilities. These surveys provided the information necessary for establishing tribute requirements that maximized imperial revenues while avoiding excessive demands that might provoke rebellion. It was a delicate balancing act that required understanding exactly how much each region could contribute without triggering widespread resistance. The transportation of tribute goods from distant provinces to imperial centers required extensive logistical coordination and infrastructure development. Archaeological evidence reveals construction of improved road networks during the Akkadian period, including bridges, way stations, and security installations designed to facilitate the movement of tribute caravans. The importation of precious metals represented a particularly important aspect of imperial resource acquisition, as these materials were essential for producing the luxury goods and ceremonial objects that demonstrated imperial wealth and cultural sophistication. Gold from Nubia and other distant sources, silver from Anatolian mines, and copper from various regional sources flowed into imperial workshops where skilled craftsmen transformed raw materials into finished products. The workshop systems that processed imported raw materials into finished goods represented sophisticated industrial operations that employed hundreds of specialized craftsmen working under imperial patronage. Archaeological excavations at Akkad and other major centers have revealed extensive workshop complexes equipped with specialized tools and facilities for metalworking, textile production, and stone carving. The management of imperial workshops required detailed knowledge of production techniques, quality control procedures, and market demands that enabled administrators to coordinate complex manufacturing operations. Administrative archives document sophisticated inventory systems that tracked raw material inputs, work in progress, and finished product outputs while maintaining quality standards. The integration of diverse regional economies into unified imperial systems created unprecedented opportunities for economic specialization and comparative advantage that increased overall productivity and wealth generation. Different regions within the empire developed specialized production capabilities based on their natural resources, traditional skills, and geographic advantages. Mesopotamian cities focused on textile production and agricultural processing. Anatolian centers specialized in metalworking, while coastal regions developed maritime commerce and fishing industries. This economic specialization was facilitated by the transportation networks and security arrangements that imperial administration provided. Agricultural innovations and irrigation projects represented fundamental components of imperial economic development that supported the population growth and urbanization necessary for maintaining large armies and complex administrative systems. The Akkadian Empire inherited sophisticated irrigation systems from its Sumerian predecessors, but expanded and improved these networks to support larger populations and more intensive agricultural production. Archaeological surveys of irrigation systems in southern Mesopotamia reveal extensive construction and maintenance activities during the Akkadian period, including excavation of new canals, repair of existing waterworks, and development of more sophisticated water management techniques. These projects required massive labor investments and sophisticated engineering capabilities. But then disaster struck. The agricultural crisis that hit Mesopotamia around 2200 BCE created conditions of unprecedented vulnerability for the Akkadian Empire, weakening the economic foundations that had sustained imperial unity for over a century. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the region reveals clear indicators of severe environmental stress during this period. We're talking about dramatic reductions in settlement sizes, abandonment of previously cultivated areas, and significant changes in agricultural practices that suggest desperate adaptations to deteriorating climatic conditions. Paleoclimatic data derived from lake sediments, tree rings, and archaeological deposits confirms that the late 3rd millennium BCE witnessed one of the most severe drought episodes in Near Eastern prehistory. Rainfall patterns were disrupted across the entire region for several decades. The environmental catastrophe manifested differently across various parts of the empire, but its effects were universally devastating for agricultural production systems that had evolved to exploit relatively stable climatic conditions. In southern Mesopotamia, the complex irrigation networks that had sustained Sumerian civilization for millennia began experiencing systematic failures as reduced river flows made it impossible to maintain adequate water supplies for extensive canal systems. This wasn't just a bad harvest year. This was systematic ecological collapse that would challenge everything the empire had built. Archaeological surveys reveal the abandonment of numerous agricultural settlements during this period, with their inhabitants apparently migrating toward remaining water sources or abandoning farming altogether. We're talking about entire communities just walking away from land. Their families had worked for generations. That's how desperate things became. Northern Mesopotamian regions, which had traditionally relied more heavily on rainfall agriculture than irrigation systems, faced equally severe challenges as precipitation levels dropped to levels insufficient for supporting grain cultivation. Tel Lilan, one of the most thoroughly excavated sites from this period, shows clear archaeological evidence of rapid abandonment around 2200 BCE, with a thick layer of wind-blown dust covering the final occupation levels. This dust layer, which accumulated over several decades, indicates that the region experienced not merely drought, but active desertification that made continued habitation impossible. Picture entire cities being slowly buried under advancing sand dunes. It's like something out of an apocalyptic movie, except this was real life 4,000 years ago. The Kabul River Valley, which had served as one of the empire's most productive agricultural regions, and a crucial corridor for trade between Mesopotamia and the Levant, experienced particularly dramatic population decline during this period. Archaeological surveys document the abandonment of over 80% of settlements in the region, with many sites showing evidence of hasty evacuation rather than gradual decline. The collapse of agricultural production in this region had cascading effects throughout the imperial economy, disrupting food supplies while eliminating a major source of tax revenues that had funded imperial administration. It was like losing your most profitable business division right when you needed money the most. The failure of agricultural systems created massive population movements as farming communities abandoned their traditional territories in search of regions where cultivation remained possible. These migrations placed enormous stress on areas that continued to receive adequate rainfall or maintained functioning irrigation systems, creating competition for scarce resources that often erupted into violent conflicts. Administrative texts from sites like Gersu describe the arrival of large numbers of refugees from northern regions, straining local food supplies while creating social tensions between established populations and desperate newcomers. Imagine thousands of climate refugees arriving in your city, all competing for the same limited resources. Social explosion was inevitable. The imperial government's response to the agricultural crisis revealed both the sophistication of Akkadian administrative systems and their ultimate limitations when confronted with challenges of such magnitude. Shah Kali-Shari, who had inherited the throne from Naram-Sin around 2217 BCE, attempted to maintain imperial unity through increased centralization of resource distribution and more intensive exploitation of regions that remained agriculturally productive. Administrative archives from his reign document systematic efforts to redirect tribute flows from affected areas while increasing demands on territories that had escaped the worst effects of the drought. These centralizing policies, while rational responses to crisis conditions, created additional stresses within the imperial system by placing unsustainable burdens on regions that were already struggling to maintain their own populations. Archaeological evidence from sites in southern Mesopotamia reveals increased fortification construction during this period, suggesting that local administrators feared rebellion from populations pressed beyond their capacity to provide additional tribute. The imperial government's attempts to maintain revenue flows through coercion, rather than economic incentives, demonstrated the extent to which environmental crisis had undermined the prosperity-based legitimacy that had sustained Akkadian rule. The breakdown of long-distance trade networks represented another crucial factor in imperial collapse, as the commercial relationships that had generated much of the empire's wealth became impossible to maintain under crisis conditions. Merchant archives from Kanesh and other Anatolian trading centers show dramatic reductions in commercial activity during the final decades of Akkadian rule. Many trading partnerships dissolved as partners could no longer fulfill their contractual obligations. The collapse of commercial networks eliminated not only direct trade revenues, but also the cultural and diplomatic relationships that had facilitated imperial administration across diverse territories. The security situation throughout the empire deteriorated rapidly as central authority weakened and local populations faced increasing desperation. Banditry became endemic along major trade routes, making commercial travel extremely dangerous, while further disrupting the economic relationships that had sustained imperial unity. Into this context of imperial weakness and social chaos came the Gutian peoples, mountain dwellers from the Zagros region, who had maintained their independence throughout the period of Akkadian expansion. The Gutians remain among the most enigmatic groups in ancient Near Eastern history, known primarily through hostile Mesopotamian sources that provide limited, reliable information about their origins, social organization, or cultural practices. Contemporary Mesopotamian texts describe the Gutians as barbarous mountain peoples who lacked the civilized institutions and cultural achievements that characterized urban societies. These descriptions, clearly influenced by ethnic prejudices and cultural biases, present the Gutians as savage destroyers who brought chaos and devastation to the sophisticated civilization of the plains. However, the success of Gutian military campaigns and their ability to maintain control over conquered territories for several decades suggests that they possessed more sophisticated organizational capabilities than their enemies were willing to acknowledge. You don't accidentally conquer an empire, even a weakened one. The Gutian homeland in the Zagros Mountains had provided them with natural defenses against Akkadian expansion, while enabling them to maintain detailed knowledge of Mesopotamian political and military developments through trade relationships and border contacts. Their mountain environment had also fostered military skills particularly suited to the type of irregular warfare that proved effective against imperial forces, weakened by internal crisis and resource shortages. Gutian warriors were accustomed to difficult terrain, harsh weather conditions, and the mobility required for successful raids against settled populations. They were essentially the ancient world's special forces, highly mobile, tough as nails, and perfectly adapted to the kind of warfare that would prove devastating to conventional armies. The initial Gutian incursions into Mesopotamian territories appear to have begun as opportunistic raids designed to exploit the weakening of imperial border defenses, rather than coordinated campaigns aimed at territorial conquest. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Mesopotamian Zagros frontier reveals increasing signs of violent destruction during the later years of Shah Shari's reign. Many settlements show evidence of sudden abandonment following attacks that destroyed defensive installations and administrative buildings. These early raids achieved remarkable success due to the deteriorating condition of imperial military forces, which had been weakened by reduced funding, supply shortages, and the demands of maintaining order in multiple crisis regions simultaneously. The professional army that had enabled Akkadian expansion under Sargon and his successors required substantial resources for equipment, training, and maintenance that the crisis-stricken imperial government could no longer provide consistently. When your military starts falling apart, opportunistic neighbors start looking very interested in your territory. Archaeological evidence from military installations reveals declining standards of equipment and construction quality during the final decades of Akkadian rule. It's like watching a once mighty machine slowly falling apart. Rusted weapons, crumbling fortifications, and demoralized soldiers who hadn't been properly equipped or paid in months. But here's what made the Gutian threat truly devastating. The psychological impact of successful Gutian raids extended far beyond their immediate military effects, demonstrating to subject populations throughout the empire that Akkadian military power was no longer invincible. When people start believing your army can be beaten, you've already lost half the battle. The divine kingship ideology that had legitimized imperial rule under Naram Sin depended heavily on perceptions of supernatural protection and invincible military might. Gutian victories challenged these fundamental assumptions while providing concrete evidence that imperial authority could be successfully resisted. If the God King's armies were losing to mountain raiders, what did that say about his divine protection? The Gutian military organization appears to have been based on tribal structures that enabled rapid mobilization of warriors, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for conducting effective guerrilla campaigns against conventional armies. Unlike the professional military forces that had characterized Akkadian expansion, Gutian armies consisted primarily of tribal warriors who could be assembled quickly for specific campaigns before dispersing back to their communities. This organizational structure made it difficult for imperial forces to engage Gutian armies in decisive battles, while enabling the mountain peoples to maintain military pressure across wide geographic areas. You can't fight an enemy you can't catch, and the Gutians had perfected the art of hit-and-run warfare. The weapons and tactics employed by Gutian forces reflected their mountain origins and the requirements of irregular warfare against superior numbers of better-equipped opponents. Archaeological evidence suggests that Gutian warriors relied heavily on archery, using composite bows that provided superior range and penetrating power compared to the simple bows still used by many Mesopotamian forces. Their knowledge of mountain terrain enabled them to establish defensive positions that negated the advantages of Akkadian siege equipment, while forcing imperial armies to fight under conditions that favored mobile defenders. The Gutians were essentially turning the empire's own advantages against it. The gradual escalation from raiding to territorial conquest occurred as Gutian leaders recognized the extent of imperial weakness and the opportunities that crisis conditions provided for permanent expansion into Mesopotamian territories. The success of initial raids had demonstrated that imperial military responses were inadequate, while providing Gutian forces with captured equipment and intelligence about Mesopotamian defensive capabilities. Archaeological evidence from sites in the Diraala River Valley shows systematic Gutian occupation of previously imperial territories, with construction of new fortifications designed according to mountain architectural traditions. These weren't just raiders anymore, they were conquerors establishing permanent presence. The Gutian conquest of major Mesopotamian cities required significant adaptations of their traditional military methods to address the challenges of siege warfare against fortified urban centers. Archaeological excavations at sites like Eshnuna reveal evidence of systematic siege operations that employed sophisticated techniques for reducing city defenses. Gutian forces appear to have learned these methods through observation of imperial siege practices, while adapting them to their own organizational capabilities and resource limitations. They were fast learners, and they had excellent teachers in the form of captured imperial engineers and defecting soldiers. The fall of Akkad itself, probably occurring around 2154 BCE, marked the symbolic end of imperial unity, even though Shar-Kali Shari may have continued to claim royal authority from other centers for several additional years. Archaeological evidence for the destruction of the capital remains elusive due to continuing uncertainty about Akkad's precise location, but contemporary texts describe the city's capture as a catastrophic event that eliminated the administrative and symbolic center of imperial government. The Gutian occupation of central Mesopotamia created a power vacuum that enabled regional governors and local rulers to declare independence from imperial authority. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the former empire reveals the rapid emergence of autonomous political entities that rejected Akkadian control while establishing their own governmental systems. These developments represented not merely political fragmentation, but the collapse of the cultural and economic integration that had characterized imperial administration. The carefully constructed unity that had taken generations to build was dissolving within decades. Lagash emerged as one of the most successful independent states during the post-Akkadian period, with its rulers Ernengiris-Su and Gudea establishing effective governmental systems that maintained prosperity despite the broader regional chaos. Archaeological excavations at Giresu have revealed extensive construction projects dating to this period, including temples, palaces, and infrastructure improvements. The artistic achievements of the Lagash rulers, particularly the numerous statues of Gudea discovered at the site, illustrate the cultural sophistication that could flourish under competent local leadership. While the empire crumbled, some regions actually thrived under skilled local management. The success of states like Lagash in maintaining order and prosperity during the Gutian period demonstrates that the collapse of imperial unity didn't necessarily lead to universal devastation. Local rulers who possessed the administrative skills and resources necessary for effective governance could create stable political entities that provided security and economic opportunities for their populations. However, these successful cases remained exceptional, as most regions experienced significant population decline and economic disruption during the post-imperial period. The fragmentation of central authority created conditions that favored the emergence of warlords and local strongmen who established control over limited territories through military force rather than administrative competence. Archaeological evidence from numerous sites reveals construction of small fortified settlements during this period, suggesting that much of the population had to seek protection from local military leaders who could provide security in exchange for tribute and service. These arrangements represented significant retreats from the sophisticated governmental systems that had characterized imperial administration. The Mesopotamian literary tradition preserved memories of the Gutian period as a time of chaos and suffering that served as divine punishment for the hubris of Akkadian rulers. The composition known as the Curse of Akkad presents the empire's collapse as the inevitable consequence of Naram-Sin's sacrilegious destruction of the Ekor temple at Nippur, which had provoked the wrath of the god Enlil. This literary work, composed during the subsequent earthly period, reflects Mesopotamian efforts to understand the catastrophic events that had destroyed their first empire, while providing theological explanations for historical developments that seemed to defy rational comprehension. The theological interpretation of imperial collapse presented in the Curse of Akkad emphasizes themes of divine justice and the consequences of royal arrogance that would become standard elements in Mesopotamian historical literature. The text describes how Naram-Sin's claim to divinity and his destruction of sacred sites had violated fundamental principles of divine human relationships, leading to supernatural punishment that manifested through military defeat, economic collapse, and social chaos. These literary interpretations provided frameworks for understanding historical events while reinforcing religious values and political norms that would discourage similar royal behavior in the future. Even in defeat, the Akkadian Empire was teaching future generations important lessons about the limits of power and the dangers of hubris. The environmental dimensions of imperial collapse receive less attention in contemporary literary sources, which focus primarily on human actions and divine responses, rather than climatic factors beyond human control. However, some texts do reference drought conditions and agricultural failures that suggest awareness of environmental contributions to the crisis. The fall of the Akkadian Empire represents one of history's most dramatic examples of how environmental crisis, political fragmentation, and military pressure can combine to destroy even the most sophisticated governmental systems. Yet from its ruins would eventually emerge new empires that learned from Akkadian achievements, while avoiding their mistakes, ensuring that the legacy of humanity's first multi-ethnic empire would influence civilization for millennia to come. The integration of these natural factors with theological explanations created complex interpretive frameworks that acknowledge both human responsibility and divine agency in historical developments. Ancient Mesopotamians weren't content with simple explanations. They understood that major historical events usually had multiple causes, both earthly and divine. But here's what's truly remarkable about the Akkadian legacy. The cultural memory of Akkadian achievements persisted throughout the period of Gutian dominance and imperial fragmentation, providing inspiration for subsequent attempts at political reunification. Even in defeat, the empire's innovations continued to influence civilization. The administrative innovations, legal precedents, and artistic achievements of the Akkadian period established standards and expectations that influenced later Mesopotamian civilizations, even when direct political continuity had been broken. Archaeological evidence reveals continued use of Akkadian administrative techniques and artistic styles in many regions, despite the collapse of central imperial authority. The preservation of Akkadian cultural traditions occurred primarily through the educational systems and scribal schools that maintain knowledge of cuneiform writing and traditional literary works. These institutions, often associated with temple complexes that possess the resources necessary for supporting educational activities, continued to train scribes in traditional techniques while preserving the textual materials that embodied Akkadian cultural achievements. Think about it. Even as the empire crumbled, teachers and students were still copying ancient texts, preserving administrative procedures, and maintaining the knowledge that would eventually enable political recovery. These scribal schools were essentially the libraries and universities of the ancient world, keeping civilization's flame alive during the Dark Ages. The gradual recovery from the crisis of the late 3rd millennium BCE required several centuries of political experimentation and cultural adaptation before stable governmental systems could be re-established. The third dynasty of which emerged around 2112 BCE, represented the first successful attempt to restore unified control over Mesopotamian territories, though even this achievement proved temporary. The lessons learned from Akkadian imperial collapse influenced subsequent approaches to governance, leading to administrative innovations designed to prevent similar catastrophic failures while maintaining the benefits of political unification. Future empires would study Akkadian mistakes as carefully as they emulated Akkadian successes. The century that followed the collapse of Akkadian imperial authority witnessed profound transformations in Mesopotamian civilization as the Gutian peoples established their dominance over the former imperial heartland, while indigenous populations adapted to radically altered political and economic conditions. The Gutian period, spanning approximately from 2154 to 2047 BCE, represents one of the most poorly documented yet significant phases in early Mesopotamian history. This era was characterized by systematic disruption of established urban hierarchies, fragmentation of long-distance trade networks, and the gradual emergence of new forms of political organization that would ultimately enable the restoration of unified government. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Mesopotamia reveals the dramatic impact of Gutian occupation on urban settlement patterns and economic activities. Major cities that had flourished under Akkadian rule experienced significant population decline as administrative functions were disrupted and commercial networks collapsed. Tel Brak, which had served as one of the empire's most important garrison cities and commercial centers, shows clear evidence of abandonment during the early Gutian period. Administrative buildings were left empty and residential areas gradually became covered by wind-blown sand. The massive palace complex constructed during Naram Sin's reign was systematically dismantled, with valuable building materials apparently removed for use in other construction projects. The disruption of urban centers extended beyond simple abandonment to include fundamental changes in the organization of remaining settlements. Archaeological surveys reveal the emergence of smaller, more dispersed communities that replace the concentrated urban populations characteristic of the Akkadian period. These new settlement patterns reflected both the security concerns of populations living under unstable political conditions and the breakdown of economic specialization that had sustained large urban centers. Communities that had previously focused on craft production or administrative functions were forced to become more self-sufficient as the trade networks that supplied their needs disappeared. The Gutian administrative system, insofar as it can be reconstructed from fragmentary evidence, appears to have been based on tribute extraction rather than the sophisticated bureaucratic structures that characterized Akkadian imperial government. Contemporary texts describe Gutian rulers demanding regular payments from subject populations while providing minimal governmental services in return. This exploitative approach created conditions of chronic instability as local populations faced increasing economic burdens without receiving the security, infrastructure maintenance, or dispute resolution services that had justified imperial taxation under previous regimes. It was like paying taxes but getting none of the government services, a recipe for rebellion. The linguistic evidence for Gutian administration remains extremely limited, with most official documents from this period written in Akkadian by Mesopotamian scribes working under Gutian oversight. This suggests that the mountain peoples lacked their own literate administrative traditions and were forced to rely on existing Mesopotamian bureaucratic personnel to manage the territories they had conquered. Trade networks that had connected Mesopotamia with distant regions experienced systematic collapse during the Gutian period, as political instability made long-distance commerce increasingly dangerous and unprofitable. Merchant archives from Anatolian trading centers show dramatic reductions in commercial correspondence with Mesopotamian partners, with many trading relationships simply disappearing from the documentary record. The standardized weights and measures that had facilitated imperial commerce were no longer enforced consistently, creating additional barriers to trade as merchants faced uncertainty about commercial standards in different territories. Without imperial oversight, the carefully constructed commercial infrastructure began falling apart. The collapse of long-distance trade had cascading effects throughout Mesopotamian society, eliminating not only the luxury goods that had sustained elite lifestyles, but also the raw materials necessary for craft production and the agricultural tools required for maintaining intensive cultivation. Archaeological evidence from workshop areas in major cities reveals the abandonment of specialized production facilities, as craftsmen could no longer obtain the materials necessary for their trades. Metal workshops that had previously produced elaborate weapons and ceremonial objects were reduced to recycling existing metal objects, while textile production declined dramatically due to disrupted trade routes. The agricultural systems that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization faced additional challenges beyond those created by the earlier climatic crisis. The breakdown of central authority meant that complex irrigation networks required for intensive agriculture no longer received systematic maintenance and coordination. Canal systems that crossed territorial boundaries became sources of conflict between competing local authorities, with upstream communities sometimes deliberately disrupting water flows to disadvantage their downstream neighbors. Archaeological surveys of irrigation systems in southern Mesopotamia reveal extensive damage and abandonment during this period, with many canals silting up due to lack of maintenance. Local populations adapted to these challenging conditions through various survival strategies that emphasized self-sufficiency and defensive capabilities over the economic specialization that had characterized urban civilization during the imperial period. Archaeological evidence reveals the construction of numerous small fortified settlements during the Gutian period, showing how people were forced to prioritize protection over prosperity. Across the vast expanse of ancient Mesopotamia, something extraordinary was happening. Communities weren't just adapting to survive, they were literally reshaping the landscape itself to match their desperate new reality. These weren't the sprawling open cities of the imperial golden age anymore. Instead, they were becoming something entirely different. Fortress cities built with one singular purpose in mind: survival. Imagine walking through this transformed world. Everywhere you looked, settlements were being constructed deliberately on the highest available ground, like islands of civilization rising above a sea of chaos. These elevated positions weren't chosen randomly, they were calculated defensive moves. From these heights, defenders could spot approaching threats from miles away, giving precious time to prepare for whatever was coming. But the real genius was in the walls themselves. These weren't decorative barriers or symbolic boundaries. They were massive defensive structures, thick enough to withstand prolonged sieges, and tall enough to make any assault a nightmare. The builders of these fortifications understood something crucial in a world where imperial protection had vanished. Your walls were literally the difference between life and death. Even more fascinating was how access to these fortress cities was controlled. Gone were the multiple gates and welcoming entrances of peaceful times. Instead, there were deliberately limited pathways leading in and out, each one designed to be easily defended by just a handful of determined fighters. Every entrance became a potential killing ground, a strategic choke point where superior numbers meant nothing if you couldn't get through. Why all this elaborate defensive planning? Because these fortified settlements weren't just protecting people, they were protecting something even more valuable than gold or precious stones: the remaining agricultural resources and water sources that kept entire populations alive. When your civilization is crumbling around you, when trade networks have collapsed and imperial granaries stand empty, whoever controls the food and water essentially controls life itself. Think about the strategic brilliance of this arrangement. These elevated strongholds became the ultimate power centers, not because of ancient bloodlines or imperial appointments, but because they controlled the absolute necessities of survival. The leaders who held these positions could literally decide who ate and who didn't, who had access to clean water and who would go thirsty. It was raw power in its most fundamental form. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. The entire social fabric of these communities was being completely rewoven from scratch. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was cultural, political, and psychological. Gone forever were the days of those complex imperial bureaucracies with their endless hierarchies, specialized departments, and administrative layers that seemed to stretch on infinitely. That whole system, built over centuries of imperial expansion, had simply collapsed under its own weight. Instead, society was becoming militarized at its absolute core. Picture the mindset shift this required. When your daily survival depends entirely on successful defense against constant threats, military strength doesn't just become important, it becomes the ultimate currency. Everything else, from trade skills to scholarly knowledge, suddenly became secondary to the simple question: can you fight and can you protect others? This environment naturally gave rise to a completely new type of leader. Local strongmen, individuals who could actually deliver real protection and tangible results, started carving out their own territories and establishing their own rules. These weren't your typical government officials, slowly climbing bureaucratic ladders through years of paperwork and political maneuvering. These were action-oriented leaders who earned loyalty through demonstrated competence, creating political systems built on direct personal relationships and proven military service rather than abstract legal authority or administrative credentials. The beauty of this new system was its brutal simplicity and surprising effectiveness. When someone proved they could keep you alive, you followed them. When they demonstrated they could secure food for your family, you supported them. When they showed they could organize successful defenses against raiders, you gave them your loyalty. It was politics stripped down to its most essential elements, raw and direct, but remarkably efficient in crisis conditions. However, this streamlined approach came with a devastating downside that would shape the entire period. These new political arrangements were incredibly volatile and unstable. The same personal loyalties that made them effective also made them fragile. Competing warlords constantly fought over the same limited resources, creating endless cycles of violence that made any meaningful economic recovery nearly impossible. Picture the vicious cycle that emerged just when things started stabilizing in one region. When crops were beginning to grow again and trade relationships were tentatively re-establishing themselves, another conflict would erupt somewhere nearby. Rival strongmen would clash over control of a water source or a particularly fertile piece of land, and the resulting warfare would destroy whatever fragile progress had been made. The human cost was staggering. Every battle meant fewer farmers to work the remaining productive land. Every raid meant destroyed crops and scattered livestock. Every siege meant depleted food stores and disrupted planting seasons. The very military focus that enabled survival in the short term was actively preventing the long-term recovery that everyone desperately needed. Yet despite this seemingly hopeless situation, despite the constant warfare and economic disruption that characterized this dark period, something remarkable was about to emerge from the chaos. Some regions, through a combination of exceptional leadership, strategic thinking, and sheer determination, would not only survive but actually thrive under these impossible conditions, proving that even in the darkest times, human ingenuity and resilience could create islands of stability and prosperity. This sets up our story perfectly for what comes next. The extraordinary success of Lagash and its brilliant leader Gudea, who would prove that effective local governance could not only survive imperial collapse, but could actually preserve and enhance the greatest achievements of Mesopotamian civilization. But here's where our story takes a dramatic turn, because even in the darkest periods of history, heroes have a way of emerging when they're needed most. Archaeological evidence from across Mesopotamia tells us that by the later Gutian period, something significant was stirring beneath the surface. Local populations weren't just building those defensive fortifications we talked about earlier, they were actively preparing for the military conflicts that would determine whether they'd remain under foreign control forever or reclaim their destiny. Enter Utu-Hegal of Uruk, a name that would echo through Mesopotamian history as the man who changed everything. This wasn't just another local strongman trying to carve out a small territory for himself. Utu-Hegal represented something much more powerful, the emergence of organized Mesopotamian resistance against Gutian rule, a turning point that would ultimately restore unified government under indigenous control. Contemporary inscriptions paint him as nothing less than a champion of Sumerian civilization itself, someone who had received divine backing for his mission to expel these foreign invaders and restore the traditional governmental practices that had made Mesopotamia the cradle of civilization. But what made Utu-Hegal truly brilliant wasn't just his vision, it was his tactical genius. His military campaigns were masterpieces of strategic adaptation. He combined the traditional Mesopotamian siege warfare techniques that had been perfected over centuries with guerrilla tactics that he had learned from studying the mountain peoples themselves. Think about the psychological impact of this approach. He was literally beating the Gutians at their own game, using their own methods against them while leveraging the superior organizational capabilities of Mesopotamian civilization. The breakthrough came around 2047 BCE, when Utu-Hegal's rebellion against Gutian authority finally reached its climax. This wasn't just another skirmish between competing warlords. This was the beginning of Mesopotamian recovery from more than a century of foreign domination and political fragmentation. After generations of subjugation, indigenous populations were finally striking back with devastating effectiveness. The decisive moment arrived at the battle near Adayabi, where Gutian forces under their king Tirigan faced off against Utu-Hegal's forces in what would become one of the most consequential battles in ancient history. When the dust settled, Tirigan's forces had been decisively defeated, proving once and for all that indigenous Mesopotamian populations possessed both the military capabilities and organizational resources necessary for overthrowing their foreign rulers. But Utu-Hegel understood that military victory alone wasn't enough. The capture of Tiragan and his subsequent execution at Nippur provided the symbolic closure that the period of Gutian domination desperately needed. This wasn't just about removing a foreign king, it was about establishing Utu-Hegel's legitimacy as a restorer of traditional Mesopotamian civilization and sending a clear message that the old order was returning. Although Utu-Hegel's reign lasted only 7 years, those brief years established crucial precedents that would reshape Mesopotamian history. The restoration of unified government that he began would be fully realized under his successor Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, but the foundation was built during these pivotal years. Archaeological evidence from Uruk reveals the incredible scope of reconstruction that took place during Utu-Hegel's reign. Extensive construction projects included repairing defensive walls that had been damaged during decades of conflict, restoring temple complexes that had fallen into disrepair, and rebuilding administrative buildings that had been destroyed during the Gutian occupation. These weren't just construction projects, they were statements of cultural revival and political renewal. What's remarkable is how these projects demonstrated both the resources that effective leadership could mobilize and the popular support that existed for restoring traditional Mesopotamian governmental institutions. People weren't just willing to work on these projects, they were eager to participate in rebuilding their civilization. The administrative innovations implemented during Utu-Hegel's reign reflected hard-learned lessons from both the spectacular successes and catastrophic failures of previous governmental systems. His officials developed revolutionary new approaches to provincial administration that balanced central coordination with local autonomy, avoiding both the excessive centralization that had contributed to Akkadian imperial collapse and the dangerous fragmentation that had characterized the Gutian period. These governmental experiments provided the essential foundations for the more systematic administrative reforms that would be implemented under the third dynasty of Ur, proving that effective governance could learn from past mistakes while building on proven strengths. The archaeological evidence for continuity and change during this post-Akkadian period reveals fascinating patterns of cultural adaptation that combined preservation of traditional practices with innovations necessitated by dramatically altered political and economic conditions. Settlement patterns show the gradual recovery of urban populations as security improved and trade networks slowly re-established themselves, but the new cities that emerged often differed significantly from their Akkadian predecessors in size, organization, and economic functions. The concentration of population in fewer, larger centers reflected both security considerations and the harsh reality of reduced resources available for supporting dispersed urban networks. It was adaptation born of necessity, but adaptation that worked. Material culture during the recovery period demonstrates selective preservation of Akkadian innovations combined with a deliberate revival of earlier Sumerian traditions that had been overshadowed during the imperial period. Pottery production shows continuation of standardized forms developed during Akkadian rule, while simultaneously reintroducing decorative techniques and vessel types, characteristic of pre-imperial Sumerian culture. This combination created hybrid material cultures that reflected the complex cultural negotiations occurring as Mesopotamian society adapted to post-imperial conditions. It wasn't about completely rejecting everything from the Akkadian period or blindly returning to pre-imperial practices. Instead, it was about carefully selecting the best elements from different periods to create something new and more resilient. The administrative practices that emerged during the recovery period incorporated crucial lessons learned from the imperial experiment, while adapting to the reduced territorial scope and resources available to the new political entities. Legal documents from this period show continuation of property law innovations introduced during the Akkadian period, including recognition of private land ownership and sophisticated commercial contracts, while religious and ceremonial practices emphasized traditional Sumerian forms that had been carefully maintained in temple institutions throughout the period of foreign domination. These adaptations created governmental systems that combined imperial administrative efficiency with traditional Mesopotamian cultural values, providing the essential foundations for the remarkable achievements of the third dynasty of Ur that would follow. But here's where the story gets truly mind-blowing, because the collapse of Akkadian political authority didn't erase the profound transformations that the world's first multi-ethnic empire had introduced to human civilization. Think about it. The administrative innovations, legal precedents, and imperial ideologies developed during that century and a half of Akkadian rule became the foundational DNA that subsequent Mesopotamian empires would adapt, refine, and expand upon for over 2,000 years. The Babylonian Empire that emerged in the early 2nd millennium BCE, under the legendary Hammurabi, inherited and systematically developed Akkadian approaches to provincial administration like a master chef perfecting an ancient recipe. They incorporated the empire's proven methods of governing diverse populations, while expanding the legal frameworks that Akkadian administrators had pioneered through trial and error. Archaeological excavations at Babylon have revealed administrative archives that demonstrate direct, unbroken continuity with Akkadian bureaucratic practices. We're talking about standardized record-keeping systems, provincial reporting procedures, and taxation methods that closely paralleled those developed under Sargon and his successors. It's like finding the original instruction manual still being used centuries later. The famous Code of Hammurabi, carved on black diorite around 1750 BCE, incorporated legal principles that had first been systematized during the Akkadian period. Concepts of proportional justice, commercial contract enforcement, and property rights that reflected the empire's innovations in managing complex economic relationships across diverse territories were all there, refined but fundamentally unchanged. The Assyrian Empire, which would eventually surpass even Akkadian territorial achievements, adopted wholesale the imperial administrative structures that had enabled Akkadian control over vast distances and diverse populations. Assyrian provincial administration employed the exact same basic framework: appointed governors, standardized tribute collection, and military garrison systems that had characterized Akkadian imperial governance. Here's what's really remarkable. The royal inscriptions of Assyrian kings like Tiglath-Pileser and Sargon II explicitly acknowledged their debt to Akkadian precedents, with several rulers actually adopting the name Sargon in conscious imitation of the great Akkadian conqueror. Talk about the ultimate tribute to a leader's legacy. The Assyrian military organization drew heavily on Akkadian innovations in professional army structure, siege warfare techniques, and logistical coordination that had enabled the First Empire's remarkable territorial expansion. Archaeological evidence from Assyrian military installations reveals siege equipment designs that clearly derive from Akkadian prototypes, while administrative texts describe supply systems and communication networks that employed methods first developed during the Akkadian period. The imperial ideology that legitimized Assyrian rule incorporated fundamental concepts that had been established during the Akkadian period, particularly the revolutionary notion that empire represented divine will expressed through earthly rulers chosen by the gods. Assyrian royal inscriptions employed literary formulas and theological arguments that closely paralleled those found in Akkadian royal texts, including claims of universal dominion, divine mandate for conquest, and supernatural protection for imperial armies. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, under rulers like Nebuchadnezzar II, continued this pattern of Akkadian institutional inheritance, employing administrative techniques and imperial ideologies that demonstrated the enduring influence of the First Empire's governmental innovations. The Babylonian provincial system, legal frameworks, and approaches to managing cultural diversity all reflected adaptations of Akkadian precedents that had been refined through centuries of imperial experimentation. Even the Persian Empire, despite its Indo-European origins and distinctive cultural traditions, adopted many of the administrative innovations that had enabled Mesopotamian imperial success. The Persian satrap system of provincial governance employed organizational principles that had been pioneered during the Akkadian period, including the appointment of royal governors, standardized tribute collection, and the integration of local elites into imperial administrative structures. But perhaps the most remarkable testament to the empire's lasting influence was the preservation and transmission of the Akkadian language itself. Despite the political collapse of Akkadian imperial authority around 2154 BCE, the Akkadian language continued to serve as the diplomatic lingua franca throughout the ancient Near East. For over a millennium, facilitating international communication and cultural exchange across vast geographic distances and diverse political entities. The diplomatic archives discovered at Tel Amarna in Egypt, dating to the 14th century BCE, provide extraordinary evidence of Akkadians' continued importance in international relations nearly 8 centuries after the empire's collapse. These cuneiform tablets, numbering in the hundreds, document correspondence between the Egyptian pharaoh and rulers throughout the Near East, including kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and various Levantine city-states. What's absolutely fascinating is that these diplomatic communications consistently used Akkadian, even when none of the corresponding rulers were ethnically Akkadian. This demonstrates the language's status as the accepted medium for international diplomacy, kind of like how English functions in global diplomacy today. The Amarna letters reveal sophisticated diplomatic protocols and legal concepts that had been established during the original Akkadian period, and subsequently became standard practices in Near Eastern international relations. Treaties, trade agreements, and diplomatic negotiations employed terminology and conceptual frameworks that derived directly from Akkadian legal and administrative traditions. Archaeological discoveries throughout the ancient Near East have revealed the remarkable geographic extent of Akkadian linguistic influence. Cuneiform tablets written in Akkadian have been found at locations ranging from Anatolia to Iran, from the Caucasus to the Arabian Peninsula, indicating the language's use in commercial, administrative, and religious contexts far beyond its original Mesopotamian homeland. The literary traditions that developed during the Akkadian period established narrative conventions and thematic frameworks that would influence Near Eastern literature for millennia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though achieving its final form during later periods, incorporated narrative elements and literary techniques that had been pioneered in Akkadian royal inscriptions and religious texts. The rediscovery of Akkadian civilization by modern scholarship represents one of archaeology's most dramatic success stories, revealing a lost empire whose achievements had been largely forgotten until 19th century excavations began uncovering the material remains of this foundational civilization. The decipherment of cuneiform writing during the mid-19th century enabled scholars to read Akkadian texts for the first time in over a millennium, opening entirely new perspectives on ancient Near Eastern history. The pioneering excavations conducted by Paul Botter at Khorsabad and Austin Henry Layard at Nimrud during the 1840s and 1850s first brought Akkadian material culture to European attention. The discovery of the Victory Stele of Naram Sin at Susa in 1898 provided dramatic visual evidence of Akkadian imperial achievements, while demonstrating the artistic sophistication that imperial patronage had fostered. This monument, along with other Akkadian sculptures and inscriptions discovered during subsequent excavations, revealed an empire whose cultural achievements matched its political innovations, establishing new appreciation for the complexity and refinement of early imperial civilization. Imagine stumbling across a vast ancient palace complex, buried beneath layers of earth, a lost administrative powerhouse of the world's first empire. That's exactly what happened at the site called Tello, investigated first by the renowned archaeologist Max Mallowan back in the 1930s, and later by teams using the most up-to-date tools of our time. What they unearthed wasn't just a handful of dusty relics, but the heart of one of Akkad's largest regional capitals, brimming with thousands of clay tablets covered in cuneiform script. Each tablet opened a window into the machine room of an empire, documenting everything from ambitious building projects to the most minute details of daily bureaucracy. For the first time, researchers could see not just the grand ambitions of the Akkadian kings, but also the fine gears that kept the machinery of imperial government turning. These discoveries busted the old stereotypes of ancient government as crude or haphazard. What emerged instead was an image of a tightly run administrative operation, an empire built on crisp record-keeping, well-organized labor, strict revenue collection, and intricate networks connecting distant corners of the realm. It was from places like Tello, not the long-lost city of Akkad itself, where empire was lived every day, managed by officials whose titles and offices were recorded in astonishing detail on those sturdy tablets. Thanks to breakthroughs in modern science, the way we study Akkad has leapfrogged beyond shovel and brush. Satellite imagery, for example, lets archaeologists sweep entire landscapes that would take centuries to search on foot alone. Digital mapping overlays ancient riverbeds, irrigation channels, and decayed roadways, revealing how centuries-old city planners once coaxed prosperity out of unforgiving terrain. Add to this the power of digital archaeology. Whole libraries of Akkadian texts are now digitized, searchable, and connected to artifact databases. Patterns jump out across time and space, how food supplies shifted year by year, how people and goods flowed through the empire, and how strategies evolved as challenges changed. These virtual tools have even helped uncover lost settlements and trade hubs previously invisible to the naked eye, rewriting our map of the ancient world and shining a light on the deep foundations of imperial power. Researchers can now piece together how vast canal networks watered fields, how roads link city to city, and how these projects allowed Akkad to feed growing populations and mobilize armies at unprecedented speed. Excavations armed with modern scientific methods are rewriting what we thought we knew from ancient texts alone. Take isotopic analysis of human bones by reading chemical signatures in ancient skeletons. Scientists have retraced patterns of migration, uncovered shifts in diet, and tracked how imperial expansion remade societies at the most basic level. Environmental archaeology now shows how the Akkadians tamed nature on a massive scale with new farming techniques, but also how those same environmental pressures like drought helped bring the empire to its knees. All of this technology-driven progress has radically deepened our understanding of what made the Akkadian Empire, often called humanity's first true multi-ethnic empire, so unique. Their experiment in ruling breathtakingly diverse peoples revealed both the dazzling potential and harsh limits of early imperial rule. On the one hand, military conquest let Sargon and his successors tap into a mosaic of cultures, blending traditions and inspiring artistic and intellectual revolutions. On the other, their vast empire faced endless tension, central power always at odds with proud local traditions and would-be rebels lurking in the provinces. The genius of Akkadian politics lay in forging unity from that chaos. They respected local customs, promoted the integration of conquered leaders into empire-wide administration, and created a flexible, dynamic model of government that successive empires, Babylonian, Assyrian, even Persian, would imitate for centuries. This wasn't just brute force, it was a powerful combination of centralized planning and cultural understanding. Their governmental toolkit included laws and legal systems that protected property, regulated business, and offered standards for courts and contracts, the groundwork for principles that would shape later civilizations far from the Fertile Crescent. Akkadian military reality deserves just as much credit. Their creators didn't simply march in with oversized armies and bludgeon their enemies into submission. Instead, they pioneered professional standing armies, introduced standardized equipment, and perfected the art of the siege. Organized and resourceful, Akkadian soldiers operated as units, disciplined, trained, and logistically supported in ways the world hadn't seen before. The footprints of their tactics and technologies spread far beyond Mesopotamia, setting the standard for ancient warfare and influencing strategies from Anatolia to Egypt. Economically, this period stands out as an age of integration and innovation. When Akkad knit distant regions together under its control, it wasn't just about collecting taxes. The government standardized weights and measures, issued mutually recognized currency, and funded massive networks for trade and transportation. This unified marketplace unleashed new levels of prosperity, allowing resources and goods to travel farther, faster, and more securely than ever. With written contracts and commercial law on the books, merchants could trade with confidence, and cities prospered even as borders shifted and rulers changed. The cultural impact of this era was just as transformative. The empire became a crucible where Sumerian and Akkadian traditions blended, giving rise to hybrids in art, literature, and even religion. New artistic techniques and unmistakable styles appeared, not simply as the output of a dominant elite, but as a dialogue across regions and backgrounds. Hymns, myths, and heroic tales were shaped in Akkadian schools and copied for generations, setting the creative blueprint for much of what followed in the ancient Near East. The goddess Ishtar, for example, gained cultic prominence that stretched from Iran to the Mediterranean, a testament to how imperial integration sparked new religious movements. Yet the tragic fate of the Akkadian state stands as a sober lesson for all who came after. The collapse wasn't merely the result of war or a single bad leader. Natural disasters, epic droughts, crop failures, and shifting weather patterns struck at the heart of the empire's carefully balanced system, leaving populations hungry and cities deserted. Meanwhile, succession crises and internal rebellions underline the frailty of holding together such a sprawling, diverse realm through sheer administrative will. The empire's end echoed through centuries. The same dynamics of center versus periphery, of innovation versus tradition, keep playing out in every great empire since. So when we look at the Akkadian Empire today, its story stretches far beyond the dusty rooms of a lost palace or the sharp lines of cuneiform tablets. Akkad was the first great act in the play of imperial history, a bold experiment in government, culture, war, and law. Its successes proved that human societies could organize themselves on a transcontinental scale. Its failures offered warning signs that even the strongest empires remain vulnerable to both natural and human challenges. The techniques, ideas, and breakthroughs forged by its leaders echoed through history, laying the groundwork for every truly global state that followed. And thanks to the relentless efforts of archaeologists, scientists, and digital detectives, that story is being pieced together anew, shining a powerful light on both our shared past and the nature of power itself. The breakthroughs in administration, law, military strategy, and cultural fusion pioneered by the Akkadian Empire laid down the very building blocks of civilization, ones that would outlast the empire itself by thousands of years. Yet, Akkad's dramatic fall remains a powerful reminder that even the most advanced societies can unravel when faced with natural disasters or internal strife. Today, as archaeologists and historians uncover its long-buried secrets, we gain so much more than a glimpse into a vanished world. We discover timeless lessons about how empires rise and fall, how organized societies adapt or collapse, and how those patterns still echo through every civilization that follows. The story of Akkad, with all its achievements and vulnerabilities, continues to shape the way we understand political power and cultural transformation across human history.